Welcome to the past unveiled, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now beginning with Story 1, The Spark in Bohemia, Ferdinand, Defenestration and Rebellion. In the year 1617, the Kingdom of Bohemia was restless. Despite being one of the wealthiest and most politically vibrant lands within the Holy Roman Empire, it stood precariously at the edge of religious division, dynastic politics, and regional resentment. You might not think of dusty legal charters or the slow turn of ecclesiastical appointments as exciting, but in Bohemia, such mundane details would light the fuse for a continent-wide war. To understand how it all began, you must travel back not just to the early 17th century, but to 1555, when the Peace of Augsburg attempted to contain religious conflict in the Holy Roman Empire. It allowed each prince to determine whether Lutheranism or Catholicism would be practiced in his lands. But Bohemia, a land with strong Hussite and Protestant traditions, existed uneasily under Catholic Habsburg rule, protected by various royal charters that ensured tolerance on paper. The succession crisis. The real turning point came with succession. Emperor Matthias, the aging and childless Habsburg ruler, sought to secure the future by arranging for his cousin, Ferdinand of Styria, to succeed him as King of Bohemia. Ferdinand was a devout Catholic, educated by Jesuits, and determined to restore Catholic orthodoxy wherever he ruled. Bohemian nobles, predominantly Protestant, were alarmed but also politically boxed in. In 1617, the Bohemian estates reluctantly agreed to crown Ferdinand as their king. It was, they hoped, a gesture that would avoid confrontation, but it only emboldened Ferdinand. Almost immediately, Ferdinand began eroding Bohemian Protestant freedoms. Catholic officials started suppressing Protestant worship in towns where it had long been tolerated. Royal charters were reinterpreted, ignored, or dismissed outright. It's important to note how bureaucratic this oppression was. Decrees were issued, council rulings overturned, and property reassigned in ways that seemed legal but betrayed the spirit of religious tolerance. It is here that we see a familiar historical pattern: oppression not through sweeping military campaigns, but through clerical decisions and legal ambiguity. The political class of Bohemia, landed nobles and urban magistrates, began to organize. The Defenestration of Prague. May 23, 1618, brought a moment that sounds dramatic but felt to many like a desperate act of procedural protest. At Prague Castle, a group of Protestant nobles confronted two Catholic regents who represented Ferdinand. The meeting descended into chaos. Arguing that the regents had violated the Letter of Majesty, a royal charter guaranteeing religious rights, the nobles threw them and their secretary out the window. Remarkably, all three men survived the 70-foot fall. Catholic chroniclers attributed their survival to angels. Protestant accounts claimed they landed in manure. Either way, the act had symbolic power. You might be tempted to think this defenestration was the real start of the 30 Years' War. In fact, it was the climax of months of political wrangling, broken promises, and the failure of imperial compromise. But what followed was war, or something increasingly resembling it. The Bohemian estates formed a provisional government and began preparing for armed conflict. They issued proclamations justifying their actions, raised troops, and sought allies among Protestant rulers in the empire and beyond. The internationalization of a local crisis. Here, the story begins to expand. The Bohemians weren't just angry subjects, they were now revolutionaries, openly rebelling against imperial rule. Their appeal to Frederick V of the Palatinate, a Calvinist prince and son-in-law to James I of England, marked a key moment. They offered him the Bohemian crown, hoping that he could rally Protestant support across Europe. Frederick hesitated but accepted. In 1619, the Bohemians formally deposed Ferdinand, who had since become Holy Roman Emperor, and crowned Frederick as King of Bohemia. It was a bold, almost naive move. Frederick had neither the military resources nor the strategic alliances to defend this new title effectively. Ferdinand, now emperor, saw this not merely as a challenge to his authority, but as an existential threat to imperial order. The Catholic League, a confederation of Catholic princes led by Maximilian of Bavaria, rallied to his cause. War was inevitable, but it wouldn't be contained in Bohemia for long. Daily life under suspicion. While all of this unfolded in courts and palaces, the towns and villages of Bohemia were changing. Clergymen were watched. Schoolteachers were interrogated. Rumors ran wild about spies, secret letters, and arms caches. Protestant burghers stockpiled food. Catholic monasteries fortified their precincts. Even the simplest acts, holding a service in a town square, baptizing a child, hanging a banner, could carry political weight. In some towns, citizens practiced both Catholic and Protestant rites, hedging their spiritual bets as uncertainty grew. This wasn't religious zeal, it was survival. Economic life slowed. Roads became unsafe. Guilds refused to send apprentices to other cities. You begin to see how fragile the everyday fabric of life became, how a political crisis at the top transformed agriculture, trade, and education across the land. By late 1619, the Bohemian Rebellion had lit fires across the empire. Protestant and Catholic states watched nervously. The Holy Roman Emperor was rallying his forces. Frederick V had taken the crown. The stage was set. But could Bohemia's fractured coalition survive the full might of the Catholic League? And what would happen to Frederick's fragile court in Prague? As the year 1620 approached, Frederick V sat uneasily on the Bohemian throne. A young man of 23, born into the elite Calvinist branch of the Protestant world, he had inherited not only the electorate of the Palatinate, but a vision of Protestant solidarity that now found itself dangerously tested. His decision to accept the Bohemian crown was seen by some as a beacon of hope, and by others as a reckless provocation. For Frederick, the move was rooted in principled defense of Protestant liberty, challenge to imperial overreach, but the political winds around him were swirling faster than he could navigate. This was not a popular monarch assuming power in a united kingdom. This was a foreign Prince German, Calvinist trying to unite a fractured land of Hussites, Lutherans, Utraquists, and skeptics. The grand dream of Protestant unity quickly became bogged down in conflicting interests, linguistic divisions, and the grinding logistics of war. Frederick's court and the reality of rule. Frederick's court in Prague was not the gilded seat of a powerful kingdom. It was a hurried construction, an imported German bureaucracy struggling to adapt to Bohemian realities. Local Protestant nobles who had once been eager to resist Ferdinand's Catholicism now grew wary of Frederick's own religious zeal. His Calvinism was unfamiliar, and to many Bohemians, especially the more moderate Lutherans, it seemed just as rigid and doctrinal as the Catholicism they had fled. Religious tensions simmered even within his allies. The Bohemian clergy were a patchwork of ideologies, Utraquists with their emphasis on communion under both kinds, evangelicals maintaining connections to Lutheran theology, and radicals shaped by memories of Jan Hus. Frederick, meanwhile, brought with him Calvinist preachers, often uncompromising and foreign. Their sermons criticized local traditions, alienating those who had hoped for a more inclusive spiritual leadership. Meanwhile, Frederick's wife, Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of England's King James, I tried to bring a sense of majesty to court life. But even she could not dispel the looming sense of dread. Her English entourage, out of place in Prague, struggled with the language, the food, and the politics. Behind the royal ceremonies, soldiers drilled in the courtyards, and envoys came bearing grim tidings from abroad. Imperial response: Ferdinand and the Catholic League. Ferdinand II, meanwhile, moved with calculated determination. After being deposed by the Bohemians, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in August 1619. His claim to power had been challenged, his honor bruised, but his resources vast. Ferdinand called upon the Catholic League, led by Maximilian I of Bavaria, to restore imperial authority in Bohemia. The Catholic League was more than a military alliance. It was a political machine, financed through church wealth and coordinated with impressive efficiency. Under the command of Johann Circles, Count of Tilly, the League's army was professional, disciplined, and eager to act. Meanwhile, Ferdinand secured an even more potent ally, Spain. The Habsburgs ruled both Austria and Spain, and the Spanish crown saw in Bohemia a critical front in the larger European struggle against Protestantism. Spanish troops and funds were dispatched, a sign of how international the conflict had become. Ferdinand also played the diplomatic game masterfully. He ensured that the Protestant Union, the confederation of Protestant states, remained fractured and uncommitted. He pressured other German princes to remain neutral or to support his cause, often reminding them that a successful rebellion in Bohemia could inspire similar unrest in their own territories. By the summer of 1620, a Catholic army of over 25,000 men was preparing to march into Bohemia. The road to White Mountain. In the months before the confrontation, Frederick and the Bohemian estates scrambled for support. Appeals were sent across Europe. Envoys visited England, the Dutch Republic, and various German courts, but aid was minimal. England, under James I, was cautious despite his daughter's position as Queen of Bohemia. The Dutch, embroiled in their own war with Spain, could offer little. The Protestant Union issued statements of sympathy but mobilized no significant forces. Frederick's forces, a mix of Bohemian levies and foreign mercenaries, were undermanned and underfunded. Supply lines were weak. Desertion was common. Local towns, weary of taxation and plunder, offered little support. In November 1620, Tilly's forces crossed into Bohemia. The confrontation would occur just outside Prague, near a gently sloping area known as Bela Hora White Mountain. The Battle of White Mountain, November 8, 1620. The Battle of White Mountain lasted less than 2 hours. Frederick's forces, entrenched but demoralized, were quickly routed by the professional Catholic army. It was not merely a military defeat, it was a psychological collapse. As Catholic cavalry overwhelmed the Protestant left flank, Frederick's generals lost control. His soldiers fled, many without firing a shot. Civilians watched from nearby hills as the Bohemian experiment crumbled before their eyes. Frederick and Elizabeth fled Prague that very evening. Their retreat was hasty and humiliating. They would spend the rest of their lives in exile, wandering through Protestant courts in search of support and shelter. The press called Frederick the Winter King, a cruel reference to the brevity of his reign. Reprisals and recatholicization. Ferdinand's victory was not merely military, it was ideological. What followed was a brutal reassertion of imperial control. The Bohemian estates were dissolved. Dozens of Protestant nobles and leaders were arrested. On June 21, 1621, 27 of them were executed in Prague's Old Town Square. Their heads were displayed publicly, a chilling message to any who might question Habsburg authority again. Catholicism was reimposed across the kingdom. Protestant churches were closed. Clergy were expelled. Education came under the control of Jesuit institutions. Even the Czech language suffered as German became dominant in administration and schooling. Land confiscations were widespread. Loyal Catholic nobles and foreign allies were rewarded with property and titles, While Bohemian Protestant families were impoverished and displaced, many fled into exile. The social fabric of Bohemia was permanently altered. It's tempting to view the Battle of White Mountain as just one skirmish in a long war, but for Bohemia, it marked a definitive end to political autonomy and religious pluralism. The dreams of the 15th century Hussites, the promises of tolerance from the 16th century, and the brief hope of 1618 were extinguished. The seeds of prolonged war. Ironically, the swift Catholic victory did not end the war, it widened it. Protestant leaders across Europe viewed the suppression of Bohemia as a harbinger of Habsburg absolutism. Rather than cowing opposition, Ferdinand's actions alarmed Protestant princes, spurred military buildup, and encouraged intervention from powers like Denmark and Sweden. In a larger sense, the Battle of White Mountain confirmed something terrible. Wars of religion were now wars of annihilation. Tolerance had failed. There was no longer room for negotiated coexistence. Each victory would bring purges, each defeat, retribution. And as for the ordinary people of Bohemia, farmers, artisans, teachers, and innkeepers, they entered a period of darkness. War would return in waves over the coming decades. Armies would trample their fields, tax their harvests, conscript their sons. Their language, their customs, their faith, all would be reshaped by imperial policy and foreign occupation. But at this early stage of the war, few could yet predict how far the flames would spread, or how deeply the empire's soil would be scorched. Was the defeat at White Mountain the end of Bohemian resistance, or the beginning of a much larger European conflagration? The dust of battle had barely settled on the slopes of White Mountain before the true reckoning began. While the battle itself was short, a mere 2 hours of chaotic fighting, it was the decades that followed which would weigh heaviest on Bohemia. For a single failed revolt had not just altered the political and religious future of one kingdom, it had become the opening chapter of one of Europe's most devastating conflicts. And in its wake, generations would suffer, systems would crumble, and borders both spiritual and territorial would be redrawn. This is not a story of valiant resurgence or military reversal. The Bohemian Revolt ended in a definitive defeat. What came after was slow, administrative, and coldly efficient, a systematic dismantling of Bohemian autonomy. And yet, even within the crushing machinery of imperial retribution, we find stories of human endurance, small resistances, and the quietly enduring spirit of a people forced underground. The fate of the Winter King and Queen. Frederick V and Elizabeth Stuart's departure from Prague was a flight, not a retreat. As they crossed the snowy fields of Bohemia, their political dreams collapsed around them. They were mocked as the Winter King and Queen, titles meant to underscore the brevity and futility of their rule. Yet they would spend more than 3 decades in exile, clinging to the remnants of their cause. Frederick moved his court in exile across Protestant Europe, spending time in Silesia, Brandenburg, and the Dutch Republic. He wrote endless letters, appealed to allies, and begged for military assistance to reclaim both the Bohemian crown and his hereditary Palatinate lands now occupied by Spanish and Bavarian forces. His finances dwindled, his supporters melted away, and his children grew up in borrowed halls, raised on stories of loss and legitimacy. Elizabeth fared better in reputation. Known for her charm and intellect, she maintained correspondence with key Protestant leaders and philosophers. Her cause remained popular among English Puritans, and her legacy would eventually carry through her descendants, most notably in her grandson, George I of Britain. But that future was still a century away. For now, their world was one of exile, frustration, and quiet despair. The Catholic recatholicization of Bohemia. While the royal couple wandered, Ferdinand II wasted no time consolidating his hold over Bohemia. The kingdom was no longer treated as a semi-autonomous entity within the empire. It became a province, to be governed directly and strictly. Protestantism was outlawed entirely. Churches were seized and handed to Catholic orders. Monasteries, once abandoned or reduced to ruins, were rebuilt with imperial funds and restaffed with Jesuits. The Jesuit order, in particular, became the engine of the Counter-Reformation. Its schools replaced existing institutions. Its priests monitored local parishes. Its influence extended into marriage, inheritance, and education. The Czech language was slowly pushed aside in administrative documents, and German began to dominate official discourse. Protestant books were burned. Sermons in Czech vanished from cities and towns. Bohemian nobles who had sided with Frederick were executed or exiled. Their lands were confiscated and redistributed to loyal Catholic nobles, many of them from abroad. Over 600 noble families lost their estates, and the structure of Bohemian society was permanently transformed. For the common people, the changes came in quieter but equally profound ways. Parish priests were replaced. Fines were imposed for failing to attend mass. Children were taken from Protestant homes and sent to Catholic institutions. Public holidays were restructured to align with Catholic feast days. Resistance, though present, was fragmented and covert. Secret Protestant gatherings took place in forests, barns, and basements, but they were dangerous and increasingly rare. Within a single generation, centuries of Bohemian religious and political diversity were largely erased, at least on the surface. The economic and social toll. Beyond religion and politics, the war left Bohemia economically devastated. Fields that had once produced wheat and hops were abandoned. Entire villages were depopulated not from battle, but from famine, disease, and migration. The nobility who had once governed local regions were replaced by absentee landlords. Taxes rose sharply to fund the imperial war effort, and even small tradesmen were burdened with levies. Bohemia had been one of the more prosperous regions of the Holy Roman Empire in the early 17th century. By the 1630s, it was a land of empty houses and crumbling roads. Merchants no longer came to Prague in large numbers. Artisans fled to safer cities. Universities lost students and teachers alike. And yet, amidst this decay, some communities adapted. Urban guilds tightened their internal networks, creating systems of mutual aid. Black markets flourished, with Protestant books smuggled in from Saxony. Folk traditions kept older beliefs alive in subtle ways through music, seasonal festivals, and coded symbols carved into doorways and family heirlooms. The spread of the war. Bohemia was only the beginning. The suppression of the revolt might have brought temporary order to the kingdom, but it stirred deep unrest throughout the empire and beyond. Protestant rulers viewed the fate of Bohemia as a warning. Any defiance of imperial Catholic authority would be met with force, confiscation, and recatholicization. Rather than pacify the Protestant states, Ferdinand's victory frightened them. Christian IV of Denmark, a Lutheran king with holdings in the empire, would intervene in 1625, bringing war to northern Germany. Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden would follow in 1630, wielding a disciplined army and a Protestant cause. France, despite being Catholic, would later enter the war on the Protestant side for geopolitical reasons. What began as a Bohemian rebellion evolved into a continent-wide struggle, a war of shifting alliances, brutal sieges, and ideological absolutism. Ferdinand's initial success in Bohemia, while militarily impressive, ultimately contributed to the escalation of the 30 Years' War. The suppression of one rebellion had made further conflict inevitable. Cultural erasure and silent resistance. The memory of the Bohemian Revolt was suppressed in official histories for over a century. Public discussion of the events of 1618-1620 was dangerous. Memorials were removed. Schools taught a version of history in which Ferdinand had saved Bohemia from chaos. But in private, families passed down stories. Folk songs recalled the Winter King and the executions in Old Town Square. In rural villages, secret Protestant worship persisted for decades, cloaked in the language of tradition rather than doctrine. Ironically, The very attempt to erase Bohemian religious and cultural identity created a deeper, if quieter, sense of distinctiveness. Protestant Czechs in exile living in Saxony, Poland, or Transylvania formed tight-knit communities, preserving their language, liturgy, and customs. They published books banned in their homeland and smuggled them back across borders. Their existence was a reminder that the defeat had not been total. And over time, as the war dragged on and the empire weakened, some of these traditions would begin to resurface slowly, tentatively, but persistently. The larger consequences. The failure of the Bohemian Revolt was a political turning point. It marked the end of any meaningful resistance to centralized Habsburg rule in the heart of Europe. The Holy Roman Emperor had asserted not just military dominance, but ideological control. The imperial system was shown to be capable of reshaping entire societies, using war, law, and religion as tools of transformation. But this victory came at a cost. The 30 Years' War would devastate vast regions of Europe. Entire populations would vanish. Economies would collapse. Trust in imperial institutions would erode. And eventually, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 would recognize the very religious pluralism that Ferdinand had tried to crush. In that sense, the Habsburg victory in Bohemia was a paradox. It won the battle but helped lose the larger war for Catholic hegemony. The iron-fisted restoration in Prague became, in hindsight, a symbol of unsustainable absolutism. A thoughtful reflection. As you sit with this history of defenestrations, exiles, forced conversions, and failed kings, you might ask, was it worth it? For the Bohemian rebels, the gamble ended in tragedy. Their bid for religious and political freedom was crushed, their leaders executed, their lands stripped. And yet, their revolt became the opening chapter of a larger European awakening, one that would, painfully and over generations, lay the groundwork for modern ideas of sovereignty, religious liberty, and statehood. And as you imagine the streets of early 17th century Prague echoing with sermons, lined with gallows, and shadowed by palace intrigue, you may wonder, what if the Bohemian estates had chosen another path? Could there have been peace through negotiation, or was war always inevitable in a Europe already cracking under the weight of its contradictions? Story 2. The Palatinate Gamble, Frederick V's Brief Winter Reign. You've already met Frederick V, husband to Elizabeth Stuart, the ill-fated Winter King, who took the Bohemian crown and lost it within a year. But to understand why this moment, his acceptance of the Bohemian throne in 1619, mattered so deeply to Europe, you must return to the Rhineland and to the Palatinate, a patchwork of prosperous river valleys, fortified towns, and Protestant ambition. The story of Frederick's brief reign in Bohemia is only half about Bohemia. The other half, the more delicate and underestimated half, concerns the strategic value of the Palatinate and the geopolitical tremors that its loss would send rippling through Europe. Frederick's choice was not just about religion. It was about territory, alliances, dynastic pride, and a deeply flawed gamble. The Palatinate, a Protestant stronghold. The Electoral Palatinate, a principality centered around the Rhine, was not a massive state, but it carried weight far beyond its size. Its capital, Heidelberg, boasted one of the oldest and most prestigious universities in Europe, and its court had long supported the Protestant cause. Most importantly, Frederick was one of the 7 Kurfürsten, or electors, of the Holy Roman Empire, a role that gave him a vote in choosing the emperor. The electors were elite princes, each of whom carried immense political leverage. In theory, they were to act as balancers between emperor and empire. In practice, they often served as factional leaders, pushing agendas that suited their region, religion, and family interests. The Palatinate had become a nerve center for the Protestant Union, an alliance of German states designed to counterbalance the Catholic League. Frederick's leadership in this union, combined with his marriage to the English king's daughter, had positioned him as a rising Protestant champion. But in 1619, When he accepted the crown of Bohemia, that perception would be tested and shattered. Frederick's character and miscalculation. Frederick V was, by all accounts, intelligent, cultured, and devout. He read theological works, supported humanist scholars, and had a deep personal commitment to Calvinism. But he was also young and politically inexperienced. When the Bohemian estates offered him the crown in 1619, he deliberated, but not for long. To him, it was a moral duty. Protestants were under siege, and to reject the throne would be to abandon them. But the political reality was far more dangerous. Accepting the crown meant defying the recently crowned Emperor Ferdinand II, a man who considered the Bohemian revolt both treasonous and sacrilegious. It also meant overextending himself. Frederick did not have the military strength, financial reserves, or regional support needed to defend both Bohemia and his home territory in the Rhineland. His advisors warned him. Some foreign allies expressed concern, but others, especially English Puritans and Dutch Calvinists, cheered the move. For them, it signaled bold resistance to imperial tyranny. In their pamphlets and sermons, Frederick was painted as a new Joshua, leading God's people against the Canaanite forces of Catholicism. But as he marched into Prague to be crowned, dark clouds formed over his homeland. The Catholic response and the Spanish invasion. When Frederick took the Bohemian crown, Emperor Ferdinand declared him an outlaw. But he didn't stop there. Ferdinand struck a deal with Maximilian I of Bavaria. The Catholic League would help crush the Bohemian rebellion, and in return, Maximilian would be granted the electoral title and the lands of the Palatinate. It was a devastating strategic move. By turning a religious war into a question of property and titles, Ferdinand secured more support than he might otherwise have gained. Maximilian now had every incentive to attack the Palatinate not just as a political ally, but as a future ruler. At the same time, Spain, another Habsburg power, entered the fray. The Spanish Road, a crucial military corridor running from Italy through the Rhineland to the Low Countries, passed through the Palatinate. Spain had long coveted secure access to this corridor to reinforce its troops during the 80 Years' War with the Dutch Republic. Now, with Frederick in rebellion, they had the perfect excuse. In 1620, Spanish forces under General Ambrogio Spinola invaded the Palatinate from the west, while Catholic League forces pressed in from the east. Towns fell quickly. Protestant garrisons, under-equipped and poorly coordinated, were no match for the seasoned armies of Spain and Bavaria. By the end of the year, just as Frederick and Elizabeth fled Bohemia, the Palatinate was crumbling. The war had followed them home. The exile and displacement. Frederick's personal loss was profound. His ancestral lands were occupied. His title as elector was stripped. The imperial diet, under Ferdinand's direction, formally transferred the electorate to Maximilian of Bavaria, a decision that altered the balance of power within the empire and intensified the confessional divide. Frederick, Elizabeth, and their children wandered from one Protestant court to another. They eventually settled in The Hague under the protection of the Dutch Republic. But their court in exile was marked by financial difficulty, diplomatic frustration, and a growing sense of futility. Still, they maintained hope. Protestant powers had not yet given up on Frederick. Many viewed his plight as symbolic of the broader struggle between Protestant liberty and Catholic absolutism. From his exile, Frederick became a figurehead, not a king, but a cause. His letters, treaties, and appeals circulated throughout Europe. English Puritans urged King James I to intervene militarily. German princes debated the risks of further resistance. Swedish and Danish envoys took note, biding their time. The Winter King's fall had become a rallying point. The political cost of the Palatinate's fall. The loss of the Palatinate had consequences beyond Frederick's personal misfortune. It altered the strategic map of the empire. The Rhineland, once a Protestant buffer, was now under Catholic control. The Spanish Road was secured. The Protestant Union, terrified and fractured, officially disbanded in 1621, leaving Protestant territories even more isolated. This shifted the center of Protestant resistance northward to the Netherlands, to Denmark, and eventually to Sweden. But it also exposed the Holy Roman Empire's internal weaknesses. Ferdinand's reliance on Spanish and Bavarian forces came at a cost. The empire was no longer simply enforcing imperial law, it was using foreign troops to punish internal dissent. This damaged its legitimacy among German princes, both Catholic and Protestant. And it set a precedent. Rebellion would be met with dispossession. Princes would not just lose battles, they would lose their titles, their lands, and their families' futures. Frederick's gamble, then, became a cautionary tale. What was gained and what was lost? For Frederick, there were no immediate gains. His reign as King of Bohemia was over in less than a year. His hereditary lands were lost. His wife gave birth to children in exile. His image, once full of promise, became a symbol of overreach. And yet his story would echo through Europe. Elizabeth Stuart, ever the loyal queen, worked tirelessly to promote her family's cause. She became a figure of sympathy among Protestants. Her letters and diplomatic appeals maintained connections between the exiled court and England, the Dutch and German princes. Their children were raised with the idea of future restitution. One son, Rupert of the Rhine, would become a military commander in the English Civil War. Another, Charles Louis, would eventually regain part of the Palatinate after the Peace of Westphalia. But those resolutions were decades away. In the early 1620s, Frederick's gamble looked like a complete and humiliating failure. A quiet reckoning. Frederick V died in exile in 1632, long before the war ended, and before any hope of restoration materialized. His final years were consumed with writing, diplomacy, and internal reflection. He had once aspired to lead a Protestant revival in Central Europe. Instead, he watched his cause fade, his lands remain occupied, and his crown lost. And yet, historians continue to debate. Was Frederick foolish or simply too idealistic for his time? Did his acceptance of the Bohemian crown provoke a wider war, or was war inevitable regardless? These questions linger, not just as academic thought, but as cautionary reflections on power, faith, and ambition. Because in Frederick's story, you see how the weight of a crown glittering with promises can conceal the burdens it brings. And it raises the question, would the 30 years, war have unfolded differently if Frederick had simply said no to Bohemia? The story of Frederick V's rise and fall could easily end with the twin catastrophes of Bohemia and the Palatinate. But in the years that followed his exile, a subtler and more torturous chapter unfolded, one marked not by military failure, but by diplomatic erosion, frustrated appeals, and the gradual realization that idealism alone could not win back a kingdom. Frederick may have fled his lands, but he did not give up his claim. He turned from battlefield to bureau, hoping that alliances, promises, and principle could restore what had been lost. Yet in the realm of diplomacy, as in war, Frederick found that no promise came without conditions, and no friend came without hesitation. We follow the exiled king as he navigates a labyrinth of Protestant inertia, shifting priorities, and the hard truth that Europe was more complex than his cause could command. A court in exile, hope in The Hague. Following his hurried departure from Prague and the loss of the Palatinate, Frederick, along with his wife, Elizabeth, and their children found refuge in the Dutch Republic. The city of The Hague became the center of his court in exile, a gathering point for Protestant thinkers, military men, and diplomats sympathetic to the Winter King. At first, the atmosphere was cautiously optimistic. The Dutch, engaged in their own long struggle against Catholic Spain, offered shelter and occasional funds. English Puritan sympathizers rallied to Elizabeth's side, praising her as a Protestant heroine. Pamphlets circulated in London depicting her, and Frederick as martyrs to imperial tyranny. But public sympathy did not easily translate into government action. King James I of England, Elizabeth's father, remained aloof. Though he had opposed the spread of Catholic power and mourned his daughter's fate, James was deeply wary of committing English troops or funds to a continental conflict. He believed in diplomacy, not war, and hoped for a marriage alliance with Spain through his son, Charles. Thus, Frederick's most powerful potential ally remained politely distant. Protestant princes, too divided to unite. Frederick's appeals to fellow Protestant rulers revealed the limits of confessional unity in 17th-century Europe. While many shared his religious convictions, few were willing to risk their thrones or treasuries to restore his. Self-preservation often outweighed principle. In Saxony, Elector John George I, a Lutheran, was cautious to a fault. He viewed Frederick's Calvinism with suspicion and feared provoking the wrath of the emperor. In Brandenburg, the Hohenzollerns were consumed with local politics and rivalries. Even within the Protestant Union, former allies now distanced themselves. The organization had officially disbanded in 1621, its members unwilling to face a war that might devour them. Moreover, Frederick's decision to accept the Bohemian crown without consulting key allies had offended many. They saw his act as rash, a disruption to the delicate religious balance within the empire. For some, his plight was a tragedy. For others, it was the predictable result of overreach. The theological divides among Protestants, Calvinists, Lutherans, Utrechists were not superficial. They translated into real political hesitancy. And so, Frederick's diplomatic mission faltered before it had truly begun. The Catholic encirclement and consolidation. As Protestant powers hesitated, Catholic forces continued to fortify their gains. The Spanish remained firmly in control of the lower Palatinate, especially the fortresses near the Rhine that were critical to their military logistics. General Spinola's campaigns had solidified Spanish dominance in the region, and the road from Milan to the Spanish Netherlands, the Spanish road, was now secure. Meanwhile, Maximilian of Bavaria took over the Upper Palatinate. In 1623, the emperor formally transferred Frederick's title of Elector to Maximilian, giving the Catholic League an even greater say in imperial affairs. This was more than symbolic. It meant that Protestant influence in the imperial diet was weakened, and decisions about the empire's future would increasingly reflect Catholic priorities. Ferdinand II's strategy was paying off. He had neutralized a major Protestant threat and rearranged the political architecture of the empire to benefit his allies. The Palatinate, once a pillar of Protestant power, had been absorbed, piece by piece, into the machinery of Catholic consolidation. Frederick, watching from afar, could do little but issue protests and dispatch pleas. Elizabeth Stuart, advocate, diplomat, and symbol. While Frederick struggled with military logistics and religious justifications, Elizabeth Stuart emerged as a far more dynamic figure within the exile court. A daughter of James I, she wielded influence through family ties, personal charisma, and a sharp political instinct. Elizabeth wrote constantly, to her father in London, to Dutch statesmen, to German princes, and to Protestant churches across Europe. Her letters blended personal appeals with political rationale, making the case that Frederick's restoration was not just about one man, but about the balance of power, the defense of faith, and the future of Europe. In England, she became a beloved figure among Puritans and parliamentarians. Her plight symbolized what they saw as the dangers of foreign Catholic encroachment and royal timidity. Plays, sermons, and poems referenced her with admiration. Yet King James remained unmoved, unwilling to jeopardize his own diplomatic balancing act. Even so, Elizabeth's presence helped maintain the court-in-exile's sense of purpose. She raised her children to believe in their father's claim, to study the history of their loss, and to prepare if the day ever came for restoration. Protestant mercenaries and the limits of warfare. By 1622, a few commanders attempted to retake portions of the Palatinate on Frederick's behalf. Ernst von Mansfeld, a professional mercenary general, led one such campaign. Another, Christian of Brunswick, young and fervently Protestant, also raised troops in Frederick's name. Their campaigns were partially successful in the early stages, reclaiming some towns and disrupting Catholic supply lines. But they lacked proper support, funding, and coordination. Mansfeld's troops, unpaid and undisciplined, pillaged Protestant villages as readily as Catholic ones. Christian of Brunswick was charismatic but reckless, often throwing his men into battles with little planning. Their advances stalled, and by 1623 they were in retreat. The defeats at the battles of Wimpfen and Stadtlohn were crushing. Mansfeld's forces scattered. Christian's army disintegrated. The dream of military restoration, at least through freelance Protestant generals, faded. These failures made Frederick's position more precarious. Each lost battle not only reduced territory, it chipped away at his legitimacy. His allies began to see his cause as a lost one. England's reluctance and continental disillusionment. Throughout this period, Frederick and Elizabeth's greatest frustration lay with England. Despite being the Queen's homeland, despite the sympathy of Parliament and the people, official support remained elusive. King James, nearing the end of his reign, clung to a pacifist diplomacy that increasingly felt out of step with the times. He hoped to negotiate with Spain, even entertain a marriage alliance between his son Charles and the Spanish Infanta. This plan horrified English Protestants, who saw Spain as the embodiment of Catholic authoritarianism. Still, James resisted pressure to intervene. When Parliament pressed him for war, he dissolved it. When diplomats urged support for Frederick, he postponed. His preference was to avoid becoming entangled in what he viewed as the empire's internal conflicts. By the early 1620s, many in the Palatine court had come to a bitter realization. There would be no English army marching to reclaim the Rhine. If restoration was to happen, it would not be through family loyalty. It would require a broader Protestant alliance. But where would that alliance come from? Looking north, the hope of Sweden and Denmark. As one door closed, another began to open. In the north, the Protestant kingdoms of Denmark and Sweden watched events unfold with increasing interest. Both had Lutheran kings with ambitions of influence within the empire. Christian IV of Denmark, in particular, considered himself a protector of northern German Protestants. In 1625, he would lead an invasion into Lower Saxony, hoping to halt the imperial advance and perhaps reclaim lost Protestant ground. This marked a new phase of the war, one no longer centered on the Rhineland or Bohemia, but on the vast and vulnerable territories of northern Germany. Frederick's personal cause was no longer the central issue, but it remained a symbol. Protestant kings invoked his plight in their declarations. His family's exile continued to stir sympathy. His court in The Hague stayed active, publishing tracts and raising funds. Though he had lost nearly everything, Frederick still represented a possibility that Protestants might one day reverse their fortunes, reclaim lost lands, and challenge imperial authority. But would that be enough? Could Protestant Europe overcome its divisions, or would each ruler simply fight for his own corner, leaving men like Frederick stranded between diplomacy and despair? By the mid-1620s, Frederick V, the so-called Winter King, had become a man suspended in history. No longer a reigning prince, yet still the claimant to a lost crown and an occupied homeland, he occupied a peculiar space in Europe's collective imagination. To some, he remained a tragic figure, a pious man undone by imperial aggression. To others, he was a failed opportunist whose rash ambition helped plunge Europe into decades of war. Frederick's court in exile, based in the Dutch Republic, persisted into the 1630s. There, among fellow Calvinists, he tried to hold together the remnants of his authority. But authority without land, without an army, and without a clear path to restoration becomes, over time, a kind of performance. And Frederick's final years would be a slow fading not into irrelevance, but into the background hum of a war that had grown larger than he ever imagined. Yet even as he disappeared from the center of events, his legacy continued to evolve, taking on new meaning in a Europe still engulfed in flames. Life in The Hague, a prince without a principality. In The Hague, Frederick and Elizabeth led a modest but active court. They lived not in a palace but in rented residences. Their household was supported through Dutch subsidies, English pensions, and occasional loans from sympathetic Protestant nobles. While their economic position was far from secure, they maintained the trappings of monarchy ceremonies, correspondence, and diplomatic formalities. Frederick remained politically active. He continued writing to Protestant rulers, proposing coalitions, offering military advice, and commissioning treatises defending his right to the Palatinate and Bohemian crowns. He followed the shifting battlefield reports with intense interest. Every Protestant victory, a minor skirmish or major battle, was scrutinized for signs of a turning tide. Elizabeth, meanwhile, became increasingly central to their court's diplomatic efforts. Her education, charm, and connections allowed her to navigate the complicated networks of Protestant politics. Where Frederick sometimes came across as dour and rigid, Elizabeth was personable, persuasive, and determined. She became the face of their court in England, Germany, and the Netherlands. Still, years passed. Their children grew, funds dried up, allies fell away, and with each passing campaign it became clearer that the dream of returning in triumph was growing more distant. The world moves on. A war expands beyond its origins. The longer the 30 years war dragged on, the more it shifted away from the particular grievances that had launched it. Bohemia had been crushed. The Palatinate was firmly in Catholic hands, and yet the war continued, fueled now by broader fears, rivalries, and ambitions. Christian IV of Denmark's campaign, 1625-1629, failed to achieve significant Protestant gains and ended with the Treaty of Lubeck. But in 1630, the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus, a military genius and devout Lutheran, landed in northern Germany with a powerful army. Backed financially by France, Gustavus aimed not just to defend Protestantism, but to reshape the European balance of power. Frederick placed great hope in Gustavus. The Swedish king seemed everything he was not: successful, strategic, and able to unite disparate Protestant interests. The two met briefly in 1631, but their relationship was strained. Gustavus admired Frederick's cause but saw little strategic benefit in restoring a man whose political and military capital had long evaporated. Even so, the Swedish campaigns did open the door to possible recovery, at least in theory. Cities once under Catholic control fell. Armies moved closer to the Rhine. But Frederick, now in his early 40s, was no longer a key player. His role had become symbolic. A personal decline. Years of stress, loss, and exile took a toll. Frederick suffered from melancholia, periods of withdrawal, and declining health. While his letters remained articulate and impassioned, they often betrayed a deepening sense of futility. The weight of failure sat heavily on him, not just politically, but personally. He had failed his people, lost his family's birthright, and seen the ideals of religious unity shattered on the battlefield. He continued to dream of reclaiming his lands and dignity. He outlined detailed proposals for alliances, drafted constitutional visions for a renewed empire, and debated with theologians over the true nature of godly rule. But as the 1630s advanced, even his most ardent supporters began to see his restoration as unlikely. Frederick died suddenly on November 29, 1632, in Mainz, while traveling in an attempt to rejoin the military campaign. Ironically, he passed away just weeks after the death of Gustavus Adolphus at the Battle of Lutzen, a moment that once again reshuffled the political and military cards of Europe. He was buried quietly in Oppenheim, far from Prague or Heidelberg. There was no triumphal return, no lands reclaimed, no crown restored. Elizabeth and the children, a legacy continued. Frederick's death left Elizabeth a widow with 13 surviving children. Far from retreating, she remained politically active, continuing to advocate for the Palatinate's restoration and securing future positions for her children. Her oldest son, Charles Louis, would eventually be reinstated as Elector of the Palatinate, though only the Lower Palatinate after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. It was a partial victory, and a reminder that in politics, time often wears down even the harshest decrees. What could not be won by Frederick in exile was returned through negotiation after decades of war. Perhaps even more significant was the family's long-term dynastic legacy. One of Frederick and Elizabeth's daughters, Sophia of the Palatinate, would later become the mother of George I of Great Britain. Through her, the Stuart line re-entered English royal succession, binding the fates of Germany and England more closely together. Thus, the Winter King left no lasting political mark in his lifetime, but through his descendants, his bloodline would shape the modern European order. Historical reflections: was it worth it? History has never quite agreed on how to judge Frederick V. Some see him as a naive idealist, a man out of his depth, swept away by forces he couldn't control. Others cast him as a tragic martyr, whose principled stand for Protestant liberty was doomed not by personal failure, but by the inertia and cowardice of his supposed allies. Modern historians have tended to view Frederick in a more nuanced light. He was not a fool, but he was unprepared. His political instincts were real but unrefined. His faith was sincere but inflexible. And in a world where power was determined as much by pragmatism as by piety, these qualities proved insufficient. More broadly, Frederick's fall helped expose the fragility of Protestant alliances in the empire. It revealed the deep fissures, religious, political, and cultural, that made unified resistance to Catholic power nearly impossible. His failure became a kind of negative template for later Protestant leaders, who understood that future campaigns would require not just unity, but a coherent geopolitical vision. A final thought. If you walk today through the halls of Heidelberg Castle, partially ruined by war and time, you will find echoes of the Palatinate's former glory. The carved stones and empty courtyards remember a time when Frederick V walked as an elector of the Holy Roman Empire, a prince who dreamed of crowns and unity and godly rule. And if you listen closely, beyond the guide's speech or the tourist chatter, you might ask, what becomes of a king who ruled for a season and spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of it? In the long, slow rhythm of history, even a winter rain can cast a shadow that lingers far into spring. Story 3: Habsburg Ambitions, the Catholic League's slow grind. In the increasingly fragmented world of the Holy Roman Empire during the early 17th century, strength did not reside in armies alone. It resided in alliances, oaths, and legal constructs that bound reluctant partners to shared causes. One of the most enduring and ultimately devastating of these was the Catholic League. Created not with fireworks but with signatures, not with fanfare but with quiet urgency, the Catholic League was the product of fear, ambition, and calculation. While Protestant states built loose associations like the Protestant Union, Catholic princes, under the shadow of Emperor Ferdinand II, and with the energetic leadership of Maximilian I of Bavaria, forged something tighter, slower, and far more effective. This is the story of the League's rise, of how a confederation of Catholic rulers became the sharp edge of imperial retribution, wielding both sword and statute to reclaim power, one town at a time. It is not a story of sudden conquests or glorious charges. It is a grind, a bureaucratic, methodical, relentless push to reorder the empire in the Habsburgs' image. The foundations of the League. The Catholic League was founded in 1609 as a direct response to the Protestant Union, which had formed earlier that same year. But while the Protestant Union was built on shared religion and fear of imperial power, the Catholic League was a different beast entirely. It was a tool of restoration, not just resistance. At its head stood Maximilian I, the Duke of Bavaria, a man as disciplined as he was devout. He was no flamboyant warlord. He disliked chaos, distrusted most of his fellow princes, and believed in order guided by Catholic law, Roman tradition, and the authority of the emperor. Where others saw opportunity in the empire's fragmentation, Maximilian saw danger. By rallying Catholic states into a formal military alliance, he hoped to stem the Protestant tide not merely by defending Catholic lands, but by reclaiming what had been lost to Protestantism in the past century. The League was not content with status quo, it wanted rollback. Its formal charter included agreements on troop contributions, mutual defense, and a shared command structure and administrative innovation, in a time when most armies were hired, irregular, and loosely bound to their sponsors. It also had something few other Protestant coalitions could match: money, and lots of it, drawn from the wealth of the southern Catholic territories and channeled through disciplined taxation. The military machine, Tilly and the teeth of the League. A structure means little without force behind it. Enter Johann Circles, Count of Tilly, the Catholic League's commanding general. Tilly was a professional soldier, born in the Spanish Netherlands and educated in the tough Catholic tradition of the late Renaissance. He was austere, fanatically devout, and utterly ruthless in the field. Where some generals sought glory, Tilly sought control. His approach to warfare was shaped by a belief that disorder was sin, and that war, to be godly, must be disciplined and decisive. Under Tilly, the League's forces became one of the most feared armies in Europe. He drilled his troops relentlessly, punished indiscipline, and insisted on cohesion. His campaigns were slow and grinding, aimed not at flashy victories but at strategic consolidation, siege by siege, region by region. Unlike the mercenary hordes employed by many imperial or Protestant states, the League's forces developed something close to professional unity. Officers were carefully chosen. Logistics were planned. Even when unpaid an inevitability in 17th century warfare, Tilly's men operated with relative order. It was not mercy that spared towns under League control, it was Maximilian's need for stability, and Tilly's belief in structure. The League and the Habsburg Plan. While Maximilian led the League, it often operated in close coordination with Ferdinand II, the newly crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Their goals aligned in many ways, though tensions between the two men occasionally surfaced. Ferdinand wanted to centralize imperial authority and enforce religious uniformity. Maximilian wanted to restore Catholic power and increase Bavaria's influence. Their collaboration paid dividends in the early 1620s. Following the Battle of White Mountain in 1620, Tilly's League forces rolled through Bohemia and neighboring regions, reinforcing Catholic control. The League then turned westward, crushing Protestant resistance in the Palatinate and other regions sympathetic to Frederick V. The League became more than an army, it became the enforcement mechanism of imperial will. Ferdinand passed edicts, Maximilian interpreted them, and Tilly enforced them. Their method was not always fast, but it was thorough. Wherever the League advanced, churches were handed to Catholic orders. Protestant pastors were expelled. Monasteries reopened. Jesuits took over universities. In town halls and village chapels, centuries of tradition were overturned in the name of one shared vision: Catholic restoration. The Edict of Restitution and the expansion of authority. In 1629, the League's slow successes inspired the boldest move of the war thus far: the Edict of Restitution. Issued by Ferdinand II and supported, though not universally, by the Catholic League, The edict aimed to return all church lands secularized since 1552 to Catholic control. This was not simply about churches. It included monasteries, universities, farms, estates, and entire towns that had once belonged to Catholic institutions, but had since been taken by Protestant rulers. It was, effectively, a massive land grab cloaked in legal theology. The League, particularly Tilly and Maximilian, now found themselves in the role of restructurers of the empire. But success bred resistance. Even moderate Protestant states that had so far avoided conflict grew alarmed. Lutheran princes who had tried to remain neutral saw their lands threatened. The very nature of compromise within the empire, a careful balancing act that had held since the Peace of Augsburg was collapsing. The League had achieved military dominance, but it had overreached politically. The Protestant backlash was building. Fractures and frustrations within the League. Despite outward strength, the Catholic League was not without internal tensions. Maximilian and Ferdinand did not always agree. Maximilian feared that too much centralization by the Habsburgs would weaken the autonomy of the German princes, including himself. At times, Maximilian delayed or resisted imperial orders. He sought guarantees that Bavarian territories would be protected. His relationship with Tilly, while respectful, was strained by differences in political vision. Tilly was loyal to the mission of Catholic supremacy above all else. Maximilian was more cautious, often weighing the risk of provoking Protestant coalitions or foreign intervention. These fissures would deepen in the 1630s as new players entered the war. The Danish intervention, 1625–1629, had already shown that foreign Protestant rulers were willing to defy the League. The Swedish invasion in 1630 would escalate the challenge. Gustavus Adolphus's highly trained army, driven by both religious fervor and political calculation, posed a threat that even Tilly's disciplined forces struggled to contain. The slow grind of the League was suddenly met with swift, mobile, and modern resistance. The long-term impact of the Catholic League's rise. The League's accomplishments were undeniable. In less than a decade, it had helped reverse over 70 years of Protestant advance in parts of the empire. It had built a functioning military system, projected power across Central Europe, and aligned itself with both papal and imperial interests. But its greatest flaw was its inability to offer a vision of coexistence. The League's victories were built on exclusion, on the belief that the empire could return to a purely Catholic past. It never considered a shared future, and in that blindness, it sowed the seeds of its decline. The arrival of Sweden in the 1630s and later France would overwhelm the League's slow, deliberate model. As the war became less about religion and more about politics and territory, the League's founding mission would seem outdated, its tools blunt. Still, its legacy endured. The Catholic League changed how alliances functioned in the empire. It demonstrated that confessional identity could be harnessed for imperial aims, and that military power, if organized and funded correctly, could shape ideology as much as ideology shaped war. A thought to close. As you think about the Catholic League not just as an army, but as a principle, you may ask, what happens when power, born of belief, forgets the people it claims to protect? Can structure and stability alone sustain an empire if they are built without consent? The League moved slowly but not forever. Its foundations, strong as they were, could not outpace the rising tides of resistance, diversity, and change. By the late 1620s, the Catholic League stood near the height of its power. Town after town had fallen, Protestant rulers had been dethroned, and the once ambitious Protestant Union was defunct. The Edict of Restitution in 1629 marked the culmination of the League's slow but steady campaign to reverse the gains of the Reformation across the Holy Roman Empire. But what seemed to be an imperial triumph concealed deeper vulnerabilities. As always in history, Victories, especially slow and calculated ones, carry the seeds of future reversals. The League's success alarmed neutral powers, alienated moderate Protestants, and strained even its own Catholic allies. The methodical grind that had served it so well began to backfire as the war entered a more volatile and international phase. The Catholic League's discipline, so effective in internal imperial conflicts, would soon be tested against foreign armies, shifting loyalties, and a form of warfare more mobile, ideological, and ruthless than it had ever faced before. Cracks in the Catholic consensus. The League had been, from its inception, a partnership of convenience. While united by faith, the Catholic princes of the empire were hardly homogeneous in their goals. Maximilian of Bavaria remained deeply skeptical of the Habsburgs' long-term ambitions. His fear, quite justifiably, was that Ferdinand II's desire to centralize imperial authority could one day threaten the sovereignty of even loyal Catholic territories like his own. This distrust simmered beneath the surface. As the emperor's influence grew, and as more Protestant lands were brought under direct imperial control, Maximilian began to worry that the League was not a partnership of equals but a tool for Habsburg dominance. Ferdinand's issuance of the Edict of Restitution in 1629 amplified these tensions. While the Catholic League supported its theological rationale, many princes, including some Catholics, found its sweeping nature destabilizing. The edict ordered the return of hundreds of former church properties that had been secularized over the past 80 years, affecting not just Protestant rulers, but also Catholic nobles who had acquired or inherited such lands. In effect, it threatened the economic interests of nearly everyone outside the Habsburg core. Even Maximilian, though he voiced no public opposition, began to see the imperial project as dangerously overreaching. The Protestant reaction, from inertia to panic. While the early 1620s were marked by Protestant disunity and inaction, the late 1620s brought a shift in tone. The complete dominance of the Catholic League and the enforcement of the Edict of Restitution awakened fears even among those who had tried to remain neutral. Moderate Lutheran rulers who had once viewed Calvinist Frederick V and the Bohemian cause as too radical now saw themselves in danger. The edict targeted all Protestant regions equally, regardless of their doctrinal nuance. Lutheran bishops, communities, and city councils began losing property and influence. Suddenly, neutrality looked like capitulation. Displaced Protestant clergy fled to safer territories. Wealthy families began moving assets to the Dutch Republic or England. Protestants who had once urged compromise now began calling for alliances, first in whispers, then in public declarations. In many towns, old loyalties frayed. Civil administrators, once loyal to the emperor, balked at implementing the edict. Appeals were filed, then ignored. Petitions were sent to Vienna. In many cases, the only result was imperial silence or further demands. The slow grind of the League had pushed too far. The Danish campaign, resistance without unity. The first serious attempt to push back came from the north. In 1625, Christian IV of Denmark, a Lutheran king and prince of the Holy Roman Empire as Duke of Holstein, launched a military intervention in support of Protestant interests. Christian's goals were complex. He sought to check imperial power, protect Protestant territories in northern Germany, and expand his own influence. Backed with financial support from England and the Dutch Republic, he assembled a sizable army and entered Lower Saxony. At first, the Catholic League seemed unsure how to respond. The war had shifted from internal rebellion to international intervention. But the League under Tilly remained focused and disciplined. After 2 years of maneuvering, Tilly crushed Christian's army at the Battle of Lutter, 1626. The defeat was total. Christian fled north, and his German allies quickly surrendered. By 1629, Christian signed the Treaty of Lubeck, agreeing to withdraw from German affairs in exchange for retaining his Danish territories. The Catholic League had won again, but this time, something had changed. Overreach, the Edict of Restitution backfires. The triumph over Denmark emboldened Ferdinand and the League. With no serious Protestant resistance left, they moved to enforce the Edict of Restitution in earnest. Dozens of Protestant bishoprics, abbeys, and estates were seized. Churches were handed over to Catholic clergy. Local officials were replaced. In towns where Lutheranism had been tolerated for decades, Jesuits arrived to re-educate the population. But this time, the Catholic League's discipline became its weakness. The rigid enforcement of imperial law, combined with the League's military presence, sparked unrest. In the city of Magdeburg, Protestant resistance turned into outright rebellion. The League responded with a siege. In May 1631, Tilly's forces stormed the city. What followed was one of the most infamous atrocities of the 30 Years' War, the sack of Magdeburg. Over 20,000 civilians were killed. The city was burned nearly to the ground. Protestant Europe was horrified. The sack of Magdeburg became a turning point not militarily, but symbolically. It painted the Catholic League not as guardians of order, but as ruthless enforcers of ideological tyranny. Pamphlets, sermons, and songs circulated throughout Germany and beyond, depicting Tilly as a butcher and Ferdinand as a tyrant. Moderate rulers who had hoped for peace now feared for their survival. Gustavus Adolphus arrives. The Protestant world's despair did not last long. In July 1630, Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, landed in northern Germany with a professional army and a strategic plan. Unlike Frederick V or Christian of Denmark, Gustavus was prepared. His army was well-trained, mobile, and supported by both Dutch and French funds. More importantly, he understood the war not just as a religious struggle, but as an opportunity to reshape the political structure of the empire. At first, the Catholic League underestimated him. Tilly, by now aging and cautious, moved slowly. But in 1631, Gustavus shocked Europe by liberating several key cities and allying with Protestant rulers who had long feared imperial retaliation. He forged a powerful alliance with the Elector of Saxony, turning the tide of the war. At the Battle of Breitenfeld, September 1631, Tilly's forces faced Gustavus's modernized army. The result was decisive. The Catholic League was defeated for the first time in a major battle. Its reputation for invincibility was shattered. The slow grind had met its match: speed, innovation, and adaptability. The beginning of the League's decline. Breitenfeld marked the beginning of the end for the Catholic League's dominance. Tilly died the following year after being wounded in battle. His death symbolized the close of an era, a time when slow, disciplined campaigns and legal restoration had seemed sufficient to remake the empire. But the war was no longer about restoration. It had become a struggle for supremacy, with France, Sweden, and others now involved. The religious character of the war began to fade behind dynastic, territorial, and strategic interests. Maximilian of Bavaria, who had once dreamed of shaping the empire through stability and discipline, now found himself fighting merely to preserve his own borders. The League continued to function, but it was no longer the defining force of Catholic power. That mantle passed to the imperial army, increasingly directed by generals like Wallenstein, whose loyalty was to money and empire more than to faith. A moment of reflection. The Catholic League had achieved more than many imagined possible. In just over a decade, it had helped crush Protestant revolts, restore Catholic property, and enforce imperial authority. But in doing so, it had provoked deeper divisions, pushed neutral parties into resistance, and helped transform a religious conflict into a pan-European war of unprecedented scale. And so we are left with the image of a league that was never truly defeated in battle, but one that could not adapt. Its strength, order, caution, Legality became its weakness in a world that was no longer bound by the old rules. What happens when an institution built for slow control faces a world hurtling toward chaos? Can discipline alone hold back the tide of history? By the early 1630s, the Catholic League, once the finely tuned engine of Habsburg ambition, and Catholic restoration, was faltering. Its greatest general, Johann Circles von Tilly, was dead. Its political anchor, Maximilian I of Bavaria, was increasingly anxious, more focused on preserving his duchy than enforcing imperial will. And its founding principle, the slow, calculated rollback of Protestantism, no longer matched the violent, rapidly shifting contours of the war. The League had been forged in a time when the Holy Roman Empire's conflicts were seen as internal, religious, and theoretically containable. But the arrival of Sweden, the re-entry of France, and the long erosion of trust between emperor and estates had dragged the 30 years' war into a wholly new phase, one of continental struggle, competing national interests, and the slow death of the imperial ideal itself. This final section traces the League's unraveling not with one final dramatic defeat, but through political exhaustion, battlefield failures, and the quiet realization that its time had passed. After Breitenfeld, a power diminished. The Battle of Breitenfeld in 1630, one had not just broken the Catholic League's battlefield record, it had punctured its mythos. Tilly's disciplined formations had been outmaneuvered, his ranks devastated by the Swedish firepower and mobility. Gustavus Adolphus had introduced new tactics, lighter artillery, integrated infantry cavalry formations, and aggressive battlefield decision-making that left traditional armies scrambling. After the loss, Tilly attempted to regroup, but suffered another blow at the Battle of Rain in 1632, where he was fatally wounded. His death ended an era of leadership defined by methodical campaigns and doctrinal certainty. With Tilly gone, Maximilian of Bavaria faced a choice: continue the war or begin negotiating for peace. The trouble was, the League was no longer a separate force capable of independent action. Increasingly, the Catholic League's remnants were being absorbed into the imperial army under Albrecht von Wallenstein, Ferdinand II's mercurial general, whose loyalty to the emperor was always tinged with personal ambition. Wallenstein had no use for the League's careful hierarchy or its confessional discipline. He raised massive armies by promising loot and land, not moral righteousness. Under his leadership, Catholic military force became more pragmatic, but also more predatory. The League had never intended to become an adjunct to the Habsburg war machine, but that is exactly what it became. Maximilian's balancing act. Maximilian I of Bavaria had once been the League's most ardent architect. Now, he was a cautious prince walking a tightrope between loyalty and survival. His duchy had suffered from repeated Swedish incursions. His fields had been scorched, his towns emptied. He petitioned the emperor for more resources and protections, but Ferdinand's ability to command and supply his armies was crumbling under the weight of debt, desertion, and competing priorities. In 1632, Munich itself, Bavaria's capital, was occupied briefly by Swedish forces. It was a humiliation for Maximilian and a clear sign that the war could no longer be controlled from Vienna or managed through committees of Catholic princes. In the years that followed, Maximilian would drift in and out of direct participation in the war, sometimes negotiating in secret with France or Sweden, sometimes reaffirming his loyalty to the emperor. His chief concern became the preservation of Bavaria, not the restoration of Christendom. This shift mirrored the broader decline of the Catholic League as an idea. Once dedicated to unity of faith and restoration of Catholic institutions, it now functioned primarily as a defensive tool for regional self-interest. The League in name only. Throughout the 1630s and into the 1640s, the Catholic League continued to exist on paper. Its structures remained, as did its name, occasionally invoked in treaties, correspondence, and recruitment efforts. But its authority was hollow. No longer did it field its own independent armies. No longer did it direct campaigns. Increasingly, its troops fought under imperial or allied banners. Its leaders deferred to Wallenstein or other imperial commanders. Its political voice was overshadowed by France, Sweden, and later even the Dutch and English. The war had evolved. Confessional boundaries blurred. France, a Catholic nation, was now openly supporting Protestant armies. The emperor himself, desperate for alliances, began entertaining compromises that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The League had no place in this new world. Its slowness, once a strength, became irrelevant. The Peace of Prague, 1635, the League dissolves. In 1635, the Peace of Prague marked the formal end of the Catholic League as an active political and military force. This treaty was designed to unify the Holy Roman Empire's internal factions, Catholic and Protestant, against foreign intervention, particularly that of France and Sweden. It aimed to halt the endless cycles of confiscation and retaliation by rolling back the Edict of Restitution and promising limited religious concessions. But most importantly, it disbanded the Catholic League. Its dissolution was quiet. There were no parades, no declarations of failure. The League simply ceased to exist as a unified entity. Its troops were absorbed. Its leadership dissolved. Its charter was archived. What had once been the spearhead of imperial Catholicism became a footnote in the wider narrative of the war. Yet its influence lingered. The League's early victories had enabled Ferdinand II's most aggressive policies. Its bureaucratic rigor had shaped military logistics for a generation, and its collapse signaled that the days of religious unity enforced or negotiated were truly over. Ghosts of the League, Afterlives and Lessons. Even after its formal end, the spirit of the Catholic League haunted the empire. In the 1640s, imperial loyalists occasionally referenced the League in letters or speeches, invoking its discipline and righteousness as a lost model. Jesuit chroniclers lamented its passing, viewing the League as the last noble attempt to restore Europe's soul. In contrast, many Protestant writers described the League as a symbol of tyranny, a dark memory of forced conversions and confiscations. In some regions, particularly in Bavaria and parts of Austria, the legacy of the League influenced local governance. The strict moral codes it had promoted became enshrined in law. Religious conformity remained a priority. Education systems designed by Jesuits during the League's ascendancy continued to operate for centuries. In a broader sense, the League's rise and fall illustrated the dangers of militant ideology fused with political centralization. It showed that power, once tied too closely to a single worldview, could galvanize resistance just as easily as obedience. And perhaps most importantly, it taught a sobering truth. Systems built for restoration cannot survive revolution. The 30 Years' War, by its midpoint, had ceased to be a war of confession. It had become a war of exhaustion. A final reflection. As you consider the story of the Catholic League from its formation in quiet council chambers to its collapse amid the roar of Swedish cannons, you might be left with a question. Can an alliance built for order endure in a world moving toward chaos? The League believed in control, in the restoration of a sacred past, in the slow application of power to reshape a fractured world. But history, as ever, refused to move backward. And in that slow grind measured not in glory, but in villages seized, lands transferred, and creeds enforced, we glimpse the melancholy truth of the 30 Years' War. That even victory, pursued without mercy or imagination, can become indistinguishable from defeat. Story 4. The Danish Intervention, Christian IV and the Struggle for Northern Germany. By 1625, much of Protestant Europe stood in muted disbelief. The Bohemian Revolt had failed. Frederick V had lost both crown and country. The Palatinate was occupied. The Catholic League, disciplined and well-funded, held broad swaths of the Holy Roman Empire, and Ferdinand II's edict of restitution hovered like a sword, threatening to turn past religious toleration into a memory. Yet even as Protestant hopes dimmed, a new figure emerged with ambition and resources to challenge Habsburg control: Christian IV of Denmark. He was a Lutheran monarch, shrewd in trade, confident in politics, and more militarily experienced than most rulers of the age. More importantly, he was both a king and a prince of the empire, ruling the Duchy of Holstein, which gave him legal and territorial footing inside the empire's complex structure. Christian's intervention is sometimes overlooked, overshadowed by the later, flashier campaigns of Sweden's Gustavus Adolphus. But the Danish phase of the 30 Years' War was a critical turning point. It revealed the fragility of the Protestant position, the opportunism of allies, and the changing face of warfare. And like so many others who dared challenge the Catholic League, Christian's story would become one of ambition met by slow, crushing opposition. Christian IV, a king with two crowns. To understand Christian's motives, one must begin with his unique position. As King of Denmark-Norway, he ruled over a substantial maritime empire that included modern-day Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and Greenland. His economy was built on Baltic trade, shipping tolls, and fisheries. As Duke of Holstein, he was also a member of the Holy Roman Empire, subject to the emperor in name, though fiercely independent in practice. Unlike the exiled Frederick V, Christian had an army, a navy, and gold from prosperous trade routes. He also had personal ambition. Denmark's traditional rival, Sweden, had recently concluded a war with Poland, and Christian saw a window of opportunity to assert Danish leadership over the Protestant cause in Germany before Gustavus Adolphus could act. But this was not purely altruistic. Christian also aimed to expand his influence in northern Germany, particularly in the bishoprics of Bremen, Verden, and Halberstadt. Control over these ecclesiastical territories would strengthen Denmark's hand both economically and politically. In short, Christian IV entered the war as both Protestant protector and strategic opportunist. The Protestant position in 1625. By the time Christian formally committed to war in 1625, the Protestant position within the empire had nearly collapsed. The Protestant Union had dissolved. Saxony and Brandenburg remained neutral. The Calvinist Palatinate was in ruins. The cities of Lower Saxony and the Hanseatic ports feared reprisals and refused to mobilize. What Christian offered was more than military muscle. He offered a cause. His declaration of war gave remaining Protestant princes something to rally behind. He signed a subsidy treaty with England King Charles I, promising funds in exchange for Christian's leadership. The Dutch Republic also offered support, though cautiously. And yet, for all this promise, Christian's coalition was shaky. His army was an amalgam of Danish royal troops, hired German mercenaries, and contingents from minor Protestant allies. Unity of command was poor. Supply chains were vulnerable. Coordination with other Protestant leaders was minimal. Still, Christian pressed forward, hopeful that the Catholic League, overextended and increasingly despised, might be vulnerable. Early campaigns, a struggle for the Weser and the Elbe. Christian's forces entered Lower Saxony in the summer of 1625, aiming to control the key river corridors of the Weser and Elbe. These were not only vital trade arteries, they were also the access routes to the bishoprics Christian coveted. His initial campaigns were moderately successful. Protestant cities welcomed his arrival. Catholic troops withdrew from some positions without battle. Christian's forces took Verden, and for a moment it seemed that a new Protestant front was opening. But Maximilian of Bavaria and the Catholic League, not easily rattled, dispatched Count Tilly with a seasoned force to meet the Danish threat. At the same time, Ferdinand II recalled Wallenstein, the Bohemian noble-turned-mercenary general, who had been dismissed earlier but was now needed to raise an independent imperial army to complement Tilly. Suddenly, Christian faced two armies, one Catholic League, one imperial, each larger and better supplied than his own. And the slow grind resumed. Wallenstein returns, a new kind of general. Albrecht von Wallenstein's return to the war marked a significant evolution in imperial strategy. Unlike Tilly, whose loyalty lay with the Catholic League and its religious mission, Wallenstein fought for power and position. He raised a vast army not through taxation or state bureaucracy, but by offering his officers and soldiers the promise of plunder, paid through requisitioning and occupation. His forces became self-sustaining and self-serving. They consumed the countryside like a plague, devastating friend and foe alike. But Wallenstein was effective. His military philosophy was one of attrition and containment. He did not seek pitched battles unless they were advantageous. Instead, he maneuvered Christian's forces into difficult terrain, cut off supplies, and fortified key crossings along the Elbe and Weser. In 1626, Tilly crushed one of Christian's German allies, Ernst von Mansfeld, at the Battle of Dessau Bridge. Later that year, Tilly defeated Christian himself at the Battle of Lutter am Barenberg, a catastrophic loss that scattered the Danish army, ended Christian's hopes of territorial gains, and destroyed Protestant momentum. Retreat, diplomacy, and the long goodbye. After Lutter, Christian fell back toward Holstein. Over the next 2 years, he tried to regroup. But Wallenstein, now operating across northern Germany, occupied much of the region and even threatened Jutland, the heart of the Danish kingdom. Christian had few good options. His allies were exhausted or disinterested. English subsidies dried up. The Dutch focused on their war with Spain. The German Protestant princes, burned by the Bohemian disaster, remained reluctant to rise again. Even within Denmark, support for the war waned. Nobles resented the costs. Merchants feared trade disruptions. The once bold vision of Danish leadership in Germany was now reduced to a desperate defense of national territory. Christian entered into negotiations. In May 1629, he signed the Treaty of Lubeck, ending Denmark's involvement in the war. The terms were surprisingly lenient. Christian retained control of his kingdom and duchy, on the condition that he would never again intervene in the empire's affairs. He accepted. A quiet aftermath. Christian returned to Copenhagen in defeat, but not disgrace. Unlike Frederick V, he had preserved his crown and his lands. He would continue to rule Denmark-Norway until 1648, modernizing his navy, improving royal administration, and preparing quietly for a world that had grown more dangerous and unpredictable. He had learned, through hard experience, that ideology was not enough. Protestant solidarity was shallow. Military strength required more than mercenaries and borrowed silver. And the Holy Roman Empire, far from a loose confederation of squabbling princes, could still act with shocking coherence when driven by religion and fear. The Protestant cause, for now, was adrift. But across the Baltic, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden was watching. Unlike Christian, he had been preparing for years. His army was trained, his coffers replenished, and his timing impeccable. The war would continue. Its center would shift north again. And this time, the Protestant banner would be carried by someone far less patient than the King of Denmark. Did Christian's failed gamble prove that foreign Protestant intervention in the empire was doomed, or did it simply come too soon? The defeat of Christian IV of Denmark on the battlefield in 1626 marked more than the loss of a campaign. It signaled the crumbling of the second great Protestant attempt to push back against Habsburg Catholic dominance within the Holy Roman Empire. But as the dust settled across the scorched fields of Lower Saxony, the true consequences of Christian's failure would play out not just in armies retreating or cities falling, but in the quiet decay of political will among Protestant rulers and the strengthening of a new imperial architecture built around Wallenstein and imperial absolutism. This was the moment when war ceased to be simply a matter of confession. Denmark's retreat marked a transition point, from a religious struggle to a dynastic, administrative, and imperial conflict, a long war with blurred boundaries, uncommitted allies, and increasingly, a civilian population caught in the middle. Christian's failure opened the door not only for further Habsburg expansion, but also for experimentation with imperial power led by a man whose ambitions knew few limits. Wallenstein ascendant. With Christian IV withdrawing into Denmark and Protestant forces scattered, the emperor's attention turned to Albrecht von Wallenstein. This Bohemian noble who had risen from minor landholder to one of the most powerful men in the empire now commanded an army that dwarfed most princely levies. By 1628, he controlled large portions of northern Germany, including key ports and trade cities along the Baltic and North Seas. Wallenstein was given the title Duke of Mecklenburg, a duchy seized from a Protestant prince, which he ruled as a reward for his services to the emperor. This act, replacing a hereditary noble with a military governor loyal only to the emperor, was shocking. It violated centuries of imperial tradition. Even Catholic princes began to whisper uneasily. If Mecklenburg could be stripped from a Protestant duke today, what could stop the emperor from taking Catholic land tomorrow? In this sense, Wallenstein became not merely a military threat to the Protestants, but a political provocation to the entire imperial system. Christian's strategy shifts to survival. Christian IV, meanwhile, returned to Denmark a changed man. The Treaty of Lubeck in 1629 had preserved his sovereignty, but barely. The memory of imperial troops threatening Jutland, Denmark's mainland, left a lasting scar. The war had cost Christian prestige, treasure, and ambition, but it had not broken his state. In the years that followed, he focused on internal consolidation, reforming tax collection, improving naval defenses, and strengthening his own control over his composite monarchy. Denmark's withdrawal did not mean Christian stopped caring about Germany. He remained in close contact with Protestant leaders and diplomats, but he had learned bitterly that intervention without allies was political suicide. From Copenhagen, he watched Protestant territories lose privileges, bishoprics be re-Catholicized, and Wallenstein's grip tighten. But there was little he could do. The responsibility to counter this imperial pressure would now fall to someone else. The Edict of Restitution, 1629, imperial overreach solidified. Even as Denmark exited the war, Ferdinand II pushed forward with his boldest religious initiative yet. The Edict of Restitution, signed in March 1629. The edict declared that all church property secularized since the Peace of Augsburg in 1552, a full 77 years prior, must be returned to the Catholic Church. This included not only churches and abbeys, but universities, farms, and entire towns. It effectively declared the past 3 generations of Protestant expansion illegal. To Ferdinand and his confessor advisors, it was a fulfillment of a divine mission. To many Protestant rulers, including Lutherans who had remained neutral, it was a terrifying overreach. Even some Catholic princes were alarmed. The edict risked destabilizing vast territories, sparking unrest, and putting too much power in the hands of the emperor and his agents, especially Wallenstein. In effect, the edict made Ferdinand appear as a kind of absolutist monarch, not the elected head of a confederation. And in a fractured empire, that perception created more enemies than allies. Protestant paralysis and the hope for negotiation. Throughout 1629 and into early 1630, Protestant politics descended into a state of confusion and fear. With Denmark gone and the edict threatening their holdings, many Protestant rulers attempted negotiation hopping to retain control of their lands by demonstrating obedience. The Elector of Saxony, one of the empire's most influential Lutheran rulers, attempted to mediate. He favored peace, feared Swedish intervention, and hoped to roll back the harshest clauses of the edict through compromise. But Ferdinand, emboldened by victory, offered few concessions. Some smaller cities and states tried to comply with the edict, only to see their bishops replaced, their lands reassigned, and their local autonomy eroded. Others, seeing the writing on the wall, began secret correspondence with foreign powers, including the Dutch and the Swedes. But the lack of unity, the fear of retribution, and the sheer weight of imperial power prevented any serious coordinated resistance. The Protestants were waiting, but for what? A quiet interlude in Denmark. Back in Denmark, Christian IV continued to rule. He had not been defeated militarily in the same way as Frederick V, and he had avoided the total loss of land that had befallen the Palatinate. But he was now a monarch in retreat from Europe's Great War. Nevertheless, Denmark began preparing quietly and slowly for the next phase. Christian expanded the Danish navy, recognizing that maritime power might be more decisive in future conflicts. He improved the fortifications of Copenhagen and reclaimed domestic support by promising that Denmark's future would not again be squandered on German wars. He also watched the rise of Gustavus Adolphus with deep interest. The King of Sweden, more aggressive, more prepared, and more politically savvy, was already planning his entrance into the war. Christian had failed, but perhaps his successor in the Protestant cause would not. Imperial fatigue and the call for balance. By 1630, even Ferdinand II could sense that victory was becoming unstable. The Edict of Restitution had sown fear. Wallenstein had sown resentment. The Protestant world had been beaten down but not destroyed. And foreign powers, Sweden, France, even the Dutch, were watching closely. Ferdinand's Catholic allies began pushing for moderation. Maximilian of Bavaria, once the emperor's staunchest supporter, now worried that Wallenstein's growing power threatened Catholic princes as well. Ferdinand, under pressure, dismissed Wallenstein in August 1630, hoping to ease tensions. It was a miscalculation. Just 1 month later, Gustavus Adolphus landed in northern Germany with a professional army, a clear political vision, and a determination to destroy Habsburg power. The cycle of Protestant resistance was beginning again, but this time it would not end in retreat. Denmark's lingering influence. Though Christian IV no longer led Protestant armies, his legacy shaped what followed. His intervention had exposed the deep divisions within Protestant politics. It had forced the emperor to rely more heavily on Wallenstein. It had tested the resolve of neutral states and demonstrated the risks of passive inaction. It also served as a blueprint not for success, but for caution. Gustavus Adolphus learned from Christian's mistakes. He avoided poor alliances, coordinated more carefully with German princes, and prioritized key strategic holdings over sweeping campaigns. Christian remained alive throughout the Swedish phase of the war. He watched from afar as Gustavus triumphed at Breitenfeld, marched into Bavaria, and challenged imperial forces in ways that Denmark never could. For a time, he even considered re-entering the war but wisely stayed out. The torch had passed, but the ground had been prepared. A thought to end. The Danish intervention was not the most glorious phase of the 30 Years' War. It ended in failure, retreat, and a treaty that banned further participation. But it revealed something deeper. That even kings must kneel before the realities of empire, inertia, and mistrust. Christian IV had vision, strength, and sincerity, but he did not have unity behind him. And in a war driven as much by fear and hesitation as by ideology, unity would prove more powerful than ambition alone. What might have happened had Christian and Gustavus joined forces earlier? Could Protestant fortunes have reversed sooner, or would the same old patterns have played out again, just under different banners? When Christian IV signed the Treaty of Lubeck in 1629, the ink may have sealed his withdrawal from the 30 Years' War, but it did not erase his impact or his failure. Unlike the flamboyant figures who fill the later chapters of the war, Christian's role as a Protestant protector seems muted, even anticlimactic. But buried in his retreat lies a different kind of importance. His campaign was neither glorious nor utterly disastrous, and in that gray space between defeat and survival, Christian carved out a legacy not of victory, but of caution, continuity, and realism. He is remembered not as a warrior king who reshaped Europe, but as a ruler who survived, adjusted, and endured a rare feat in a war that devoured so many of its champions. This final section examines what followed after Christian left the field, how his war changed Denmark, how his decisions informed future conflicts, and why his caution became a kind of strength amid decades of chaos. The post-war kingdom, recovery in silence. After 1629, Denmark stepped out of the spotlight of European politics. While Gustavus Adolphus prepared his grand campaigns, and the Holy Roman Empire descended further into internal ruin, Christian turned inward. Denmark, unlike many parts of Germany, had not been scorched. The fields still yielded crops, the cities still traded goods, and the treasury, while strained, had not collapsed. The king initiated reforms to taxation, expanded the Danish navy, and improved the administration of his scattered North Atlantic possessions. Christian's reputation at home remained strong. He had failed to win the war, but he had also protected the realm from occupation. To the Danish nobility, who had much to lose, this pragmatism mattered more than ideology. His government became more centralized. His control over the nobility increased. Ironically, the war that had humbled Christian in Germany helped him tighten his grip at home. A cautious watcher of the war. Though officially neutral, Denmark did not ignore the war as it dragged on. Christian remained an active observer, reading battle reports, following Swedish movements, and maintaining contact with Protestant diplomats and agents across the empire. He kept lines of communication open with France, Sweden, and even some Catholic rulers. Denmark became, quietly, a diplomatic bridge, one of the few Protestant powers not actively at war, but still invested in the outcome. In 1643, long after Christian had left the battlefield, Denmark would be dragged back into the conflict not by ideology, but by geopolitical rivalry with Sweden. The Torstenson War, a localized conflict between the two Scandinavian powers, unfolded during the broader chaos of the 30 Years' War, but had little to do with the original religious disputes. It reflected the new shape of the war, dynastic, territorial, and far from the theological origins of 1618. In that war, Christian fared poorly. Swedish armies invaded Jutland and threatened Danish sovereignty again. But the peace treaty of Berm-Sebro, 1645, allowed Denmark to retain most of its core lands, albeit at the cost of several provinces. It was a reminder that even neutrality could not protect small states forever in a Europe ruled by empires. The Protestant cause without Denmark. With Denmark gone, the Protestant cause passed into new hands, first Gustavus Adolphus, then France's Cardinal Richelieu, and finally into the negotiating rooms that led to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Unlike Frederick V or the early Protestant Union, Christian had never positioned himself as a radical. He was a Lutheran monarch who disliked Calvinist excesses, distrusted foreign meddling, and saw the empire as something to be reformed, not destroyed. His vision of Protestantism was conservative, and as the war's later phases evolved into outright revolution, Christian's careful approach began to seem out of step with events. And yet, as Germany burned, his retreat began to look wise. While Protestant cities were razed, populations decimated, and confessional lines were drawn at sword point, Christian presided over a stable, functioning kingdom. Denmark remained a Protestant state with no Catholic pressure. Its schools, churches, and printing presses continued to flourish. Danish merchants capitalized on the disruption of German trade. In the end, Christian had lost his chance at shaping Europe, but he had preserved his nation. A personal legacy: the king, the father, the failure. Christian IV ruled Denmark-Norway for nearly 60 years, making him one of the longest-reigning monarchs in European history. He died in 1648, just months before the Peace of Westphalia brought an end to the 30 Years' War. In Denmark, he is remembered with mixed feelings. He was a dynamic king, energetic, ambitious, often impulsive but deeply dedicated to his kingdom. His building projects, naval reforms, and legal changes outlasted his military ventures. Yet the memory of the failed German campaign persisted. His letters from that time, now preserved in archives, reveal a man who believed deeply in the Protestant cause, yet constantly found himself hampered by weak allies, insufficient funds, and the grinding effectiveness of the Catholic League. He never blamed others openly, but in private, he lamented the divisions among Protestant states, the coldness of English promises, and the devastating precision of Tilly's campaigns. Christian had not fallen like Frederick V, he had not died like Gustavus Adolphus. He had instead outlived them all, scarred, chastened, and perhaps wiser. Denmark's enduring role. In the broader arc of European history, Denmark's intervention in the 30 Years' War was a brief flare. It did not alter borders or spark revolutions, but it illuminated key truths: that Protestant states were divided, disorganized, and often more interested in local power than shared faith; that the Holy Roman Empire, though fragmented, could still be terrifyingly effective under central leadership; that religious ideology without strategy was not enough. In the Peace of Westphalia, Denmark played no decisive role, but its quiet survival became, in a sense, a model for small states in a world of empires. Speak carefully, fight cautiously, and know when to withdraw. The 30 Years' War rewarded neither the bold nor the passive, but those who navigated between the two. A closing reflection. Christian IV's intervention in the 30 Years' War is easy to overlook, bracketed as it is between more dramatic chapters of revolution and revival. But there's something profoundly human in his arc. He tried, he lost, and he lived with the consequences. He ruled not just through victory, but through compromise, retreat, and patience. And in the end, he left Denmark intact, damaged, yes, but standing. What do we make of such a legacy? Is survival a kind of success when all around you lies ruin? Or does the failure to act decisively, to reshape the world, mark the true end of greatness? Story 5. Wallenstein's Rise: Mercenaries and Politics. In the theater of the 30 Years' War, few figures stand as enigmatically and powerfully as Albrecht von Wallenstein. A man of contradictions, both aristocrat and upstart, soldier and philosopher, Catholic convert and opportunist, Wallenstein rose from the provincial nobility of Bohemia to command the largest army Europe had seen in centuries. His methods were revolutionary, his loyalty conditional, his rise unlike any other. To understand Wallenstein is to understand how war, once fought by princes and paid for with taxes, became a business, a transactional, profit-driven venture where the line between loyalty and self-interest blurred. This is not the story of a battlefield genius in the mold of Gustavus Adolphus. Wallenstein's genius was administrative. He mastered logistics, funding, and the art of negotiation. His was a quiet form of power, the kind that could destroy cities without lifting a sword. And behind his rise lies a darker truth. In a long, grinding war like the 30 Years' War, it was not kings or generals, but warlords and financiers who began to call the tune. From lesser noble to imperial favorite. Born in 1583 to a modestly noble Protestant family in Bohemia, Albrecht von Wallenstein was not predestined for greatness. He lost both parents as a child and was educated by the Jesuits, where he converted to Catholicism, a decision that, while personal, also proved politically expedient as the Counter-Reformation gained ground in Central Europe. His early career was shaped not by arms but by accumulation. He married into wealth. His first wife, a rich widow, died shortly after marriage, leaving him with a substantial estate. He reinvested those profits into land, loans, and military contracts, gradually rising through the ranks of Habsburg service. By the time the Bohemian Revolt broke out in 1618, Wallenstein had cast his lot with the Catholic Habsburgs. He raised a regiment at his own expense, fought with distinction, and profited handsomely from confiscated lands after the Battle of White Mountain. Many of his fellow Bohemian nobles were executed or exiled. Wallenstein, now a trusted imperial servant, bought their estates at cut rates. By 1625, he was one of the largest landowners in Bohemia, and his appetite for expansion had only grown. The military entrepreneur, rethinking war. Most armies in the early phases of the 30 Years' War were funded through state treasuries or noble levies, slow, uncertain, and dependent on fragile alliances. Wallenstein proposed something new to Emperor Ferdinand II. Let him raise an army at his own expense, in exchange for autonomy, titles, and the right to profit from the land his army occupied. Ferdinand, lacking funds but desperate for troops, agreed. Wallenstein began raising what would become a massive imperial army by some accounts, 50,000 to 100,000 strong at its peak, by leveraging credit, promising plunder, and creating a system of self-funding warfare. His officers and suppliers were paid in anticipation of future conquests. Villages and towns were taxed or looted to feed the troops. Neutral regions, Protestant or Catholic, were forced to quarter soldiers and surrender supplies. It was brutal but effective. Wallenstein built not just an army but a military economy, where warfare sustained itself. He pioneered logistics networks, established supply magazines, and enforced surprising levels of discipline, especially by the standards of the time. Unlike many commanders, he wasn't chasing glory, he was building infrastructure. Loyalty to the emperor, within limits. Ferdinand II admired Wallenstein's effectiveness, but distrusted his ambition. Wallenstein, for his part, never saw himself as a mere servant of the crown. He demanded autonomy, bypassed local governors, and negotiated directly with cities. His troops flew the imperial banner, but they answered only to him. In 1628, Ferdinand rewarded Wallenstein with the title Duke of Mecklenburg, granting him lands confiscated from Protestant nobles. This was more than a reward, it was a message. The emperor was willing to replace hereditary rulers with military loyalists, and Wallenstein was now not just a general but a political power broker. This made enemies among both Protestants and Catholics. The Catholic League, led by Maximilian of Bavaria, resented Wallenstein's independence. They had fought for religious restoration. Wallenstein seemed to fight for money, influence, and control. His troops occupied Catholic as well as Protestant territories. His taxation was indiscriminate. His governance, while efficient, was seen as arrogant and lawless. Yet Ferdinand, facing threats from Denmark, Sweden, and a collapsing imperial economy, continued to rely on him. The Wallenstein system, rule through logistics. Wallenstein's army did not merely fight battles. It occupied, taxed, and administered. In occupied territories, he established contribution systems agreements where towns paid a fixed sum to avoid being looted. Local officials were retained but subordinated to military administrators. Civilian populations were burdened with quartering obligations, food requisitions, and labor demands. Wallenstein monitored everything: grain inventories, horse counts, currency fluctuations. He employed mathematicians and engineers to plan encampments, construct fortresses, and lay siege to cities with minimal bloodshed but maximum effect. In this sense, his system resembled early total war. It blurred the line between civilian and combatant. Towns surrendered not because they were bombarded, but because they were bled dry. His methods prefigured modern military occupation: efficient, extractive, and deeply unpopular. A polarizing figure. To his allies, Wallenstein was a necessary evil, a man whose talents outweighed his arrogance. To his enemies, he was a tyrant in general's clothing, a military overlord exploiting a crumbling empire for personal gain. He was famously aloof, issuing orders from ornate tents, wearing astrologers' robes, and surrounding himself with mystics, mathematicians, and sycophants. He studied horoscopes before battles. He rarely spoke in council, preferring to dictate memos, and he cultivated an image of destiny as if fate had chosen him as the empire's true stabilizer. His soldiers admired his efficiency. Many feared his punishments but appreciated the predictability of his command. His officers were often loyal to him personally, not to the emperor. This cult of personality made him indispensable and dangerous. By 1630, with the Protestant world in disarray and Sweden preparing to invade, Wallenstein stood at the apex of power. And that's when it all began to unravel. The gathering storm. As Wallenstein's influence expanded, so too did the number of complaints reaching Ferdinand II's court. Catholic princes accused him of undermining their authority. The Spanish Habsburgs disliked his independence. The Pope viewed his treatment of Catholic cities as sacrilegious. Even within the imperial court, jealous factions warned that he was plotting to carve out an empire of his own. In response to these growing pressures, and perhaps fearing that Wallenstein had become too powerful, Ferdinand made a dramatic decision. In August 1630, under pressure from Catholic allies and hoping to ease political tensions, the emperor dismissed Wallenstein from command. No charges were filed, no accusations made public. Wallenstein retired to his estates in Bohemia, ostensibly defeated, but still wealthy, well-connected, and watching closely. It was one of the most consequential dismissals in European military history. Because just a few months later, Gustavus Adolphus landed in Pomerania, and the empire would soon regret casting aside its most effective commander. A final thought. Wallenstein's rise reveals not only the evolving nature of warfare in early modern Europe, but also the fragility of imperial authority when power is outsourced to the ambitious. He was neither hero nor villain, but something more complicated. A man who saw in war not chaos, but opportunity. And his story prompts the uneasy question. When the state can no longer afford to wage war, what happens when it sells that right to someone who can? Dismissed in 1630, Wallenstein retreated to his Bohemian estates in silence. The cities he once governed no longer sent tributes. The roads he built fell into disuse. For a time, it seemed that Albrecht von Wallenstein, once Duke of Mecklenburg, commander of the imperial army, and Europe's most feared military entrepreneur, had faded into history. But Wallenstein had not disappeared. He was watching, calculating, waiting. Across the Holy Roman Empire, the Protestant cause was stirring again, this time, under a different flag. In June 1630, the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus landed on German shores, bringing with him a new kind of Protestant intervention, coordinated, professional, and deeply ideological. In the months that followed, Swedish victories mounted. The Catholic League suffered defeats. Imperial forces wavered. Panic returned to Vienna. And in this moment of imperial vulnerability, the emperor made a fateful decision. He would recall the man he once cast aside. Thus began Wallenstein's second rise, more ambitious, more calculating, and ultimately more dangerous than before. The Emperor's Dilemma. By early 1632, the Emperor Ferdinand II faced a crisis. His dismissal of Wallenstein had won him favor with the Catholic League, but it had cost him military effectiveness. The Swedish army had scored a decisive victory at the Battle of Breitenfeld, 1631, crushing the imperial army under Tilly and opening a corridor into the heart of Germany. Gustavus Adolphus marched unchallenged through Franconia and into Bavaria. Protestant princes rallied to him. Even Catholic regions began to accept his occupation, preferring Swedish order over imperial decay. Vienna, too, felt threatened. Desperate, Ferdinand turned once again to the man he had dismissed. In December 1631, he sent envoys to Wallenstein's estate in Gitchen, offering a return to command. But Wallenstein would not come easily. He demanded complete autonomy, no oversight from the Catholic League, no interference from rival generals. He insisted on appointing his own officers and controlling diplomatic correspondence. He would serve the emperor, but only as his generalissimo, supreme commander of all imperial forces. It was a risky gamble, but the emperor, with little choice, accepted. The Second Army, larger, smarter, meaner. Within weeks of his return, Wallenstein began raising a new army. Drawing on his network of financiers, bankers, and suppliers, he assembled a force that by the summer of 1632 rivaled anything Europe had seen. He recruited veterans, mercenaries, and conscripts from across the empire. He expanded supply lines, reinforced key fortresses, and negotiated with neutral cities for provisions. This new army was not merely an echo of his earlier force, it was leaner, better trained, and more disciplined. He introduced reforms in command structure, supply logistics, and field communications. His officers reported directly to him, bypassing imperial bureaucracy. Importantly, Wallenstein avoided open battle in the early months. He knew that Gustavus Adolphus was a brilliant field commander, agile, daring, and beloved by his troops. Wallenstein's style was the opposite, defensive, measured, attritional. He believed that time and position were his greatest weapons, not shock, not glory. The chess match, Wallenstein versus Gustavus Adolphus. By mid-1632, the war reached a new turning point, the direct confrontation between Wallenstein and Gustavus Adolphus. They were polar opposites. Gustavus, bold, ideological, charismatic, a devout Lutheran who saw himself as the sword of Protestant Europe. Wallenstein, secretive, cold, pragmatic, a Catholic by conversion but more interested in power than faith. Their armies maneuvered across Saxony and Franconia in a deadly strategic dance. Wallenstein sought to draw Gustavus into disadvantageous terrain. Gustavus aimed to force Wallenstein into open battle. This tension culminated in November 1632, near the city of Lutzen. There, the two commanders finally met in one of the war's most fateful clashes. The Battle of Lutzen, November 16, 1632. The Battle of Lutzen was one of the bloodiest confrontations of the 30 Years' War. Shrouded in fog, confusion, and smoke, it was less a tidy engagement than a chaotic melee. Wallenstein had entrenched his forces near the town, securing key positions and relying on terrain to blunt Swedish charges. Gustavus, aware that time was against him, launched an aggressive assault. The Swedes fought with ferocity, overrunning the initial imperial lines. Wallenstein, wounded early in the fighting, continued to direct movements from a stretcher. As the battle raged, a fog descended, confusing formations and cutting visibility. In the chaos, Gustavus Adolphus was killed, reportedly shot while leading a cavalry charge. His death threw the Swedish army into disarray, but by afternoon they had regrouped, pressing hard and eventually forcing the Imperials to withdraw. Lutzen was technically a Swedish victory, but a hollow one. The loss of their king devastated Protestant morale. Wallenstein, though retreating, preserved much of his force and lived to fight another day. and in the vacuum left by Gustavus's death, Wallenstein's influence only grew. Power without battle. Following Lutzen, Wallenstein began a new phase of strategy, not war but diplomacy. He opened secret negotiations with Protestant princes, and even with the enemy. He sought to create a third bloc, a union of moderate Catholics and Lutherans, who could negotiate peace independent of both the emperor and Sweden. His vision was not of conquest but rebalancing, a Europe with fewer foreign interventions, an empire where Wallenstein, perhaps, would wield near-sovereign authority over a central zone of power, militarily autonomous, economically self-sufficient, politically indispensable. But this plan was fraught with danger. He had returned to power on the emperor's mercy, but now he seemed to negotiate behind the emperor's back. To many at court, Wallenstein looked less like a general and more like a kingmaker, or worse, a traitor. And whispers began to spread. The tension mounts. By late 1633, Wallenstein's enemies were numerous. Catholic League officials viewed his negotiations as heretical. Imperial nobles feared his growing independence. Ferdinand II, always suspicious, began to reconsider the wisdom of his appointment. Wallenstein, increasingly isolated, moved his army to Pilsen, where he surrounded himself with loyal officers and continued diplomatic overtures. He remained aloof, speaking often of fate, astrology, and divine alignment. Some believed he was mentally unwell. Others feared he was preparing a coup. The imperial court, pressured by factions from Spain, Bavaria, and the papacy, declared Wallenstein untrustworthy. In early 1634, Ferdinand authorized his arrest, dead or alive. The man once considered indispensable was now marked for death. An unresolved question. Wallenstein's return from exile was not merely a political comeback. It was a test of how much power a man could accumulate within a crumbling empire. He challenged the idea that loyalty to a throne must be unconditional. He redefined what it meant to be a general, and he dared to imagine a peace not dictated by Vienna or Rome, but by himself. But perhaps he had pushed too far. Could a man who treated war as enterprise ever truly serve an empire built on faith and fealty? Or had the empire, in relying on men like him, already traded those values away? In the bleak winter of 1634, Albrecht von Wallenstein sat at the summit of his own design, a commander who had rebuilt the imperial army, bested Sweden's advance, and brokered peace behind the scenes. Yet in that same winter, he would be murdered by his own officers, abandoned by the emperor he served, and erased from power not by cannon fire, but by suspicion and betrayal. Wallenstein's fall was not the product of one mistake, but the result of many small rifts, accumulated mistrust, political rivals, opaque ambitions, and a growing sense that he no longer served the empire, but sought to become one himself. This final section traces the final days of Wallenstein's life, a story not of glory or battle, but of quiet assassinations, sealed orders, and imperial paranoia. It is a fitting end for a man who redefined loyalty in war and who ultimately became a victim of the very political machinery he once mastered. The general who would be king. By early 1634, Wallenstein had grown distant from the Habsburg court. Though still generalissimo, he rarely visited Vienna. Instead, he held court in Bohemia, moving between his estates and fortified towns, surrounded by loyal officers and astrologers, issuing decrees independent of the emperor. He spoke often of peace not just with Sweden and Protestant states, but with France, the great Catholic rival of the Habsburgs. These secret negotiations alarmed Ferdinand II, who had long feared that Wallenstein might split the empire, or worse, align with the enemy. The general's behavior became erratic. He dismissed Catholic League troops from his command. He ignored imperial directives. He moved slowly against enemies when he could have struck quickly. To some, he looked like a man plotting rebellion. To others, he was merely exhausted seeking peace after a decade of relentless warfare. Whatever the truth, the rumors grew louder. Wallenstein had too much power, too much ambition, and too few allies. The conspiracy in Vienna. At the Habsburg court, conservative Catholic factions urged the emperor to act. The Jesuits, the Spanish ambassador, and Maximilian of Bavaria all agreed. Wallenstein had to be removed by any means necessary. Ferdinand hesitated. Wallenstein had once saved the empire, but in January 1634 the decision was made. A secret imperial decree was issued. Wallenstein was to be arrested, and if he resisted, killed. The arrest order was concealed beneath layers of secrecy. Officers across the empire were contacted individually, urged to choose sides, either remain loyal to the emperor or to Wallenstein. The decision had to be made quickly. The military, once united under Wallenstein's command, fractured overnight. Flight to Eger. Wallenstein, sensing the shift in mood, gathered a small circle of loyal officers and departed from his base in Pilsen to the walled city of Eger-Cheb, near the imperial border. He had hoped to rally support, perhaps escape to Saxony or negotiate peace on his own terms, but his power was crumbling. Fewer officers responded to his calls. Cities closed their gates. Messages went unanswered. At Eger he was trapped. His entourage was small trusted men like Count Tersky, Christian Ilo, and Adam Trchka, all veterans of his campaigns. They dined with him nightly, unaware that imperial assassins were already among them. The officers of the Eger garrison, loyal to Vienna, had received sealed orders. On February 25, 1634, they would carry them out. The night of the assassins. On the evening of February 25, Wallenstein's inner circle gathered for supper at the castle in Eger. They laughed, reminisced, drank wine unaware that their final hours had begun. Just after the meal, imperial officers led by Captain Walter Butler, an Irish Catholic in Habsburg service, burst into the hall and stabbed Trchka, Ilo, and Tersky to death. Wallenstein himself was not present. He had retired to his chambers, reportedly wrapped in a fur-lined robe, studying the stars. When the assassins reached him, he offered no resistance. According to one account, he spread his arms and said calmly, "You may strike me down. I have given you no cause." A moment later, a pikeman drove a halberd through his chest. The man who once commanded 100,000 troops died alone, unarmed and abandoned. The emperor's silence. The assassination was never publicly acknowledged. The imperial court issued no grand statement. No charges were read. No formal trial ever occurred. Instead, Wallenstein's name was quietly erased from official records. His estates were confiscated. His allies were imprisoned or executed. His enemies were rewarded. Captain Butler and the others received titles and gold for their service. But even within the imperial ranks, there was unease. Wallenstein had been controversial but not convicted. To many, his death felt more like a political purge than an execution of justice. And the emperor, he offered no comment. In a war full of massacres and betrayals, Wallenstein's murder became just another grim page in a dark chronicle. The legacy of the warlord. What remains of Wallenstein's legacy? To some, he was a traitor, a commander who put ambition above loyalty, who negotiated with the enemy and undermined the emperor. To others, he was a visionary, a man who saw the futility of the war and tried to end it, who brought discipline and organization to a chaotic imperial machine. His innovations outlived him. Logistics-based warfare, self-funding armies, political military autonomy, occupation governance. These ideas would reappear in later conflicts in Napoleonic campaigns, in 19th-century imperialism, and even in modern war economies. But Wallenstein himself became a cautionary tale, proof that a general who builds his own state within a state can never truly be trusted. A quiet reflection. Unlike Gustavus Adolphus, Wallenstein left no noble tomb, no heroic poems. His end came not with a charge or cannonade, but in whispers, sealed letters, and midnight knives. He belonged to an era where ideology gave way to opportunism, and where the lines between commander, ruler, and tyrant were no longer clear. His final tragedy was not just his murder, it was that he had no one left to mourn him. What becomes of a man who built an empire within an empire when both decide he no longer belongs? Story 6. The Edict of Restitution and the Collapse of Compromise. By the late 1620s, the Holy Roman Empire was exhausted, though far from at peace. The early religious uprisings, the Bohemian and Danish phases, had been crushed militarily. Catholic armies under generals like Tilly and Wallenstein were ascendant. The Protestant cause seemed fractured, foreign support uncertain. But just as military victory seemed within reach for Emperor Ferdinand II, he made a decision that would reignite the war and break what fragile consensus still held. That decision was the Edict of Restitution, issued in 1629, a sweeping and uncompromising imperial decree that sought to restore all Catholic Church properties secularized since 1552. It was more than a legal maneuver. It was a declaration of intent. Ferdinand intended to use military victory to reshape the religious landscape of the empire in Catholic terms. But the edict did not bring restoration. It brought revolt, division, and a collapse of the imperial center. In trying to roll back the clock by 70 years, Ferdinand shattered the delicate balance that had held the empire together. This is the story of how a legal, ecclesiastical decree helped reignite a continental war, and how, in trying to impose unity, the emperor ensured disintegration. Ferdinand II and the idea of Catholic uniformity. Ferdinand II was not a pragmatist. He was a deeply devout Catholic, trained by Jesuits and shaped by the trauma of the Reformation. For him, religious pluralism was not tolerable, it was a wound in the body politic, a rebellion against the divinely ordered world. His goal was never just military victory. He believed the 30 years war could and should end in a restoration of Catholic harmony across the empire. To many, especially among the Catholic League, this was not just desirable, it was overdue. Since the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, which allowed each prince to determine the religion of their territory, cuius regio, ius religio, the empire had operated in a religious détente. But the Augsburg Agreement only recognized Catholics and Lutherans, not Calvinists, who were gaining ground. More importantly, many church lands, monasteries, bishoprics, abbeys had been seized by Protestant rulers, secularized, and turned into sources of regional income. For devout Catholics, this was not just theft, it was heresy. Ferdinand now had the armies and momentum to act. The contents of the edict. The Edict of Restitution, issued on March 6, 1629, declared, all Catholic ecclesiastical property taken since 1552 was to be returned to the Catholic Church. Lutheran rulers who had administered bishoprics or abbeys were to surrender control immediately. Protestant subjects in ecclesiastical principalities were to either convert or leave. The scope was massive. The edict affected hundreds of cities, towns, and territories across the empire, especially in northern Germany, where secularized Catholic holdings were common. This wasn't just about religion. These were economic assets, land, income, trade rights. Rulers who had long treated these holdings as part of their patrimony were now ordered to return them, without compensation, to the church. For many Protestant princes, the edict was a declaration of war by legal means. Reactions, shock, resistance, and fear. The edict fell like a thunderclap. Even some moderate Catholics were concerned. The empire had enjoyed a relative lull in fighting since Christian IV's retreat in 1629. Ferdinand's military success had opened a door for peace, or at least a pause, but the edict made clear that there would be no compromise. For Protestant rulers, particularly in the north and northwest, the decree was unacceptable. It not only threatened their religious authority but undermined their property rights, regional influence, and political standing. In Brunswick, Magdeburg, and Bremen, local governments refused to comply. Protestant theologians decried the edict as a betrayal of imperial law. Cities that had remained neutral or passive now began to rearm. Even more critically, some Lutheran princes who had not supported earlier rebellions now began to consider siding with Sweden or France. The edict had turned passive dissent into active resistance. The limits of enforcement. Despite the boldness of the decree, Ferdinand lacked the bureaucratic machinery to enforce it uniformly. He relied heavily on local Catholic officials and the military presence of the Catholic League and imperial armies, often led by Wallenstein. But this presented a problem. In some regions, Wallenstein's army had already extracted heavy contributions and stirred resentment. Local populations were unwilling to support further imperial interference. Some territories were religiously mixed, making enforcement of a single-faith policy practically impossible. In others, secularized properties had been transformed beyond recognition. Cathedrals turned into town halls, abbeys into farms. Returning them to ecclesiastical use would disrupt entire economies. The edict, intended to unify, instead revealed just how diverse and fragmented the empire had become. The alienation of allies. One of the edict's unintended consequences was the alienation of the emperor's own supporters. The Catholic League, led by Maximilian of Bavaria, had fought for the faith but also for political autonomy. They feared that Ferdinand's overreach would provoke new wars. Moderate Lutherans, especially in Saxony, who had thus far remained neutral or loyal to the emperor, began to reconsider their stance. Even Spain, Ferdinand's Habsburg cousin, was wary. They did not want to see Germany consumed in another wave of war just as France began to stir. In effect, the edict repolarized the empire, undoing years of diplomacy and pushing once reluctant states back toward rebellion or foreign alliance. It was not a military defeat, but it may have been a political disaster. The slow collapse of authority. Throughout 1629 and into 1630, tensions simmered. In some cities, imperial commissioners were dispatched to seize properties. In others, armed clashes broke out as Protestant communities refused to vacate church lands. Resistance hardened. At the same time, Sweden's intervention was looming. Gustavus Adolphus had been preparing for war, and the edict provided a powerful propaganda tool. He could now claim to be the defender not just of Protestant faith, but of legal order and local autonomy. Ferdinand, ironically, had given his enemies a cause that transcended religion. Even some Catholic rulers now feared imperial absolutism more than Protestant pluralism. The edict's promise of restoration had instead sparked a slow-motion collapse of imperial legitimacy. Ferdinand's miscalculation. Historians continue to debate why Ferdinand issued the Edict of Restitution when he did. Was it a sincere act of faith, a political calculation, a reward for Catholic allies? Whatever the motive, the effect was clear. The edict overreached. It attempted to impose uniformity in an empire built on compromise. It failed to recognize the reality that, after 80 years of reformation and political decentralization, the Holy Roman Empire was no longer a place where unity could be decreed. Ferdinand had won battles, but he misunderstood the nature of his own empire. It was a place of layered identities, local power, religious diversity, and negotiated authority. The edict tore at the very fabric of that arrangement. Closing reflection. In a war full of sieges, massacres, and dramatic campaigns, the Edict of Restitution stands apart. It was not a weapon of war, but a tool of bureaucracy and law, meant to end conflict by decree. Instead, it made clear that no decree could restore a vanished world. What happens when the law no longer reflects the reality it tries to govern? And can an empire survive when its own ruler no longer understands what holds it together? Following the eruption of resistance against the Edict of Restitution, Ferdinand II found himself increasingly isolated within his own empire. The war had shifted from battlefield victories to a deepening political and constitutional crisis, one where loyalties were strained, compromises shattered, and once reliable allies grew hesitant. To salvage what remained of imperial authority, Ferdinand convened the Reichstag, or Imperial Diet, in Regensburg in July 1630. His goal was to consolidate Catholic gains, secure loyalty, and lay the groundwork for future imperial succession. But instead of reasserting unity, the Diet exposed the fundamental fractures that the edict had caused. This session would prove to be one of the most consequential political assemblies of the 30 Years' War. It was at Regensburg that Ferdinand's carefully built edifice of imperial power began to collapse, not because of military defeat, but because of political overreach. The stage, Regensburg in 1630. The city of Regensburg, nestled along the Danube, had long been a traditional seat for imperial gatherings. For Ferdinand, the choice was symbolic. Here, he could present himself not as a tyrant enforcing religious uniformity, but as a lawful emperor presiding over the empire's deliberative body. But the timing was inauspicious. The Protestant powers were still reeling, but the arrival of Gustavus Adolphus's Swedish army was imminent. Wallenstein's dominance had alarmed both Catholic and Protestant leaders alike. Many of the emperor's Catholic allies, especially Bavaria and Spain, had begun to question his aggressive centralization of power. When the electors and princes arrived, they brought more skepticism than support. The Catholic League turns cold. Ferdinand had assumed that his fellow Catholic rulers would welcome the Edict of Restitution. After all, it promised the return of vast properties to the Church and strengthened Catholic dominance. But many League members, including Maximilian I of Bavaria, had grown increasingly wary of Wallenstein's power and the unpredictable consequences of religious overreach. At Regensburg, these tensions came to a head. Ferdinand was pressured to dismiss Wallenstein, who by then commanded over 100,000 troops and operated independently of the Catholic League. The edict's enforcement had created new local rebellions, damaging League stability. Spain, needing help in its own wars in the Netherlands, urged Ferdinand to de-escalate to free up resources. Facing united pressure, Ferdinand reluctantly agreed to dismiss Wallenstein in August 1630, a decision that would haunt him within 2 years when Sweden invaded, and Wallenstein's leadership was desperately needed again. The matter of the succession. Another key agenda item at Regensburg was Ferdinand's desire to have his son, Ferdinand III, elected King of the Romans, a title that would secure his future succession as Holy Roman Emperor. Ferdinand II saw this as necessary to ensure dynastic continuity and prevent instability after his death. But the electors were not so easily convinced. Saxony and Brandenburg, both Protestant, saw this as further centralization of Habsburg power. Even Catholic electors hesitated, fearing that securing succession for another Habsburg would embolden Ferdinand's absolutist ambitions. Despite repeated attempts, the Diet refused to elect Ferdinand III, marking a rare and public political defeat for the emperor. This rejection sent a clear message. Even among the Catholic elite, the emperor's power had limits. The hidden threat: Sweden prepares. As the Diet deliberated, news began to arrive. Gustavus Adolphus had landed on the shores of Pomerania with a well-trained Swedish army. This changed the political atmosphere overnight. Ferdinand had hoped that the edict would finalize a Catholic victory. Instead, it became a justification for renewed Protestant resistance, now with foreign support. Gustavus framed his campaign not merely in religious terms, but as a defense of German liberties and a check against imperial tyranny. The timing could not have been worse for Ferdinand. He had just dismissed his most competent general and alienated moderate allies. The Reichstag ended in a haze of frustration and distrust: no unity, no succession, no clear plan to deal with the Swedish threat. Protestant princes shift position. One of the long-term effects of the edict and the Regensburg Diet was the political migration of certain Protestant rulers who had remained neutral. The Elector of Saxony, traditionally a cautious and pragmatic Lutheran, began secret negotiations with Gustavus Adolphus. Protestant imperial cities, such as Magdeburg and Nuremberg, grew emboldened in their resistance. Calvinist rulers, like those in the Palatinate, who were not protected by the Peace of Augsburg, now had a reason to fight for broader religious inclusion. The Swedish invasion, combined with imperial overreach, created an opportunity for a new Protestant coalition, not just to defend faith, but to defend regional autonomy and the legal order that the edict had undermined. The breakdown of trust. The true impact of the Regensburg Diet was the collapse of trust in Ferdinand's leadership. To Protestants, the Edict of Restitution proved that Ferdinand could not be trusted to uphold constitutional balance. To Catholics, the emperor's willingness to compromise only when cornered made him seem weak. To foreign observers, the empire appeared fractured, ripe for intervention. The 30 Years' War had already been devastating, but the edict and the failed attempt to solidify it at Regensburg showed that there was no clear endgame. No side could impose peace, and no emperor could enforce order without alienating someone. Ferdinand's isolation. After Regensburg, Ferdinand was increasingly alone. His most effective general, Wallenstein, was gone. His Catholic allies were cautious and self-interested. His Protestant subjects were actively seeking foreign aid. His son's succession was delayed, with no guarantee of future support. The emperor who had once seemed poised to restore a Catholic empire was now besieged militarily, politically, and diplomatically. The Great Restoration had become a strategic disaster. An open-ended consequence. The Regensburg Diet, rather than resolving the tensions created by the Edict of Restitution, exposed the limits of imperial ambition in a fractured and pluralistic empire. It revealed the dangerous gap between the ideals of religious uniformity and the realities of constitutional governance in the Holy Roman Empire. It showed that even emperors must bow to the web of local powers, foreign pressures, and historical contingencies. And it raised an unsettling question. What happens to an empire when its own structures no longer support its ruler's vision? And can a war driven by ideology ever truly end when both sides see compromise as defeat? The year is 1631, and the Holy Roman Empire stands in a precarious state. 2 years have passed since Emperor Ferdinand II issued the Edict of Restitution, and the political consequences of that sweeping decree have begun to unravel the foundations of his power. What was once framed as a divine and righteous effort to restore Catholic lands and faith has instead exposed the limits of imperial authority, reignited Protestant resistance, and invited new foreign intervention. We trace how the edict, through its enforcement and reaction, contributed directly to the escalation of the war, the entry of Sweden as a major power, and the complete transformation of the 30 Years' War from a primarily religious conflict to one of state interest and survival. The path from a written decree to continental war is a story not of abrupt shocks, but of slow erosion, a steady crumbling of trust, legality, and shared interest that once allowed the empire to hold itself together. A fragile peace shattered. In the immediate aftermath of the Edict of Restitution, imperial officials moved to enforce restitution in key areas, especially in northern Germany, where Lutheran rulers had long held former Catholic lands. In cities like Magdeburg, imperial agents demanded the handover of church property. In bishoprics like Halberstadt and Bremen, Protestant administrators were replaced or threatened. In regions with mixed religious populations, forced conversions were threatened, and thousands of Protestant families faced exile or religious coercion. Even among loyalist Protestant rulers, the edict was seen as a betrayal of the Peace of Augsburg, which had allowed for a measure of religious coexistence. Now, Ferdinand seemed bent not only on religious uniformity, but on re-centralizing imperial authority, diminishing the power of local princes. What might have remained localized unrest instead became a nationwide resistance fueled by fear of imperial absolutism and aided by the growing presence of a foreign Protestant savior, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. The turning point, the sack of Magdeburg. Nothing illustrated the consequences of the edict, and the war it inflamed more than the sack of Magdeburg in May 1631. Magdeburg, a major Protestant stronghold, had refused to comply with the edict. It resisted imperial authority and declared its alignment with Sweden. In response, General Tilly, commander of the Catholic League forces, laid siege to the city. After months of blockade and bombardment, the city fell. What followed was a massacre. Imperial troops looted and set the city ablaze. Over 20,000 civilians were killed, and the once prosperous city was left in ruins. The horror of Magdeburg shocked Europe. Even Catholic observers were appalled. The name Magdeburgization became synonymous with destruction on a biblical scale. The imperial campaign, intended to assert legal authority, had instead solidified Protestant unity and provided Gustavus Adolphus with moral justification for his full intervention. The edict had lit the match. Magdeburg had ignited the fire. Gustavus Adolphus, from defender to liberator. Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, had long contemplated entering the war. He feared Habsburg dominance on the Baltic, and his Lutheran faith aligned him with Germany's embattled Protestants. But the Edict of Restitution gave his cause a clear moral and political foundation. He was no longer simply intervening in a foreign civil war. He was now defending the legal order of the empire and protecting Protestant rights. Cities that had hesitated to support Sweden now opened their gates. German princes who feared reprisal for holding former church lands saw the Swedish king as their best hope for survival. In August 1630, he landed in Pomerania. By the end of 1631, he had scored major victories, including the decisive Battle of Breitenfeld, where imperial forces were routed. Gustavus brought with him not just troops, but a new model of war. Centralized command, mobile infantry, artillery coordination, and a coherent political ideology. His arrival marked the end of the first phase of the war and the beginning of a new, far more complex one, where foreign powers, shifting alliances, and national interests would eclipse confessional concerns. The emperor's reversal, a retreat from absolutism. Faced with this worsening crisis, Emperor Ferdinand II was forced into a series of humiliating reversals. The Edict of Restitution, once touted as non-negotiable, was increasingly unenforceable. At the Leipzig Conference in early 1631, Protestant princes openly denounced the edict, and formed a defensive alliance, a direct challenge to imperial sovereignty. In secret, Ferdinand began to scale back enforcement, offering temporary suspensions in certain regions to try and win back allies. But the damage had already been done. The emperor's credibility had collapsed. He had alienated moderate allies, emboldened foreign intervention, and transformed a manageable civil conflict into a pan-European war. The edict had overreached, and now it had to be quietly ignored, even as the war it provoked escalated far beyond its original purpose. The broader consequences. The collapse of compromise within the empire set off a chain of long-term consequences. Institutional breakdown. The Holy Roman Empire was never a centralized state. It functioned through a delicate balance of electors, princes, cities, and church leaders. The edict undermined this model by bypassing consent and relying on military force to impose legal change. Secularization of the war. What had begun as a religious conflict was increasingly about territory, power, and prestige. France, a Catholic state, would soon support Protestant forces not out of theology, but to weaken the Habsburgs. Erosion of imperial authority. Ferdinand's attempt to strengthen the empire ended by weakening it. The edict exposed the emperor's inability to govern without consent and sparked fears of absolutism among both Protestant and Catholic elites. Prolongation of the conflict. Rather than settle disputes, the edict escalated them. Protestant unity, which had been shattered after Denmark's defeat, was reforged in opposition to imperial overreach. And once foreign powers were involved, the war could no longer be settled by internal negotiations alone. Lessons in overreach. It is easy, in hindsight, to view the Edict of Restitution as a mistake, but for Ferdinand II, it made perfect sense within his worldview. He had won on the battlefield. He believed he had divine support. He saw the religious diversity of the empire not as strength, but as sickness. But in trying to restore an imagined past, he failed to understand the realities of the present. The Protestant world had changed. The political landscape had changed, and the imperial crown, while glittering, no longer carried unquestioned authority. The edict, instead of securing peace, opened the gates to one of the war's most violent and destructive phases. Final reflection. By 1632, the 30 Years' War was no longer a war of restoration, it was a war of survival. The Edict of Restitution, though still technically in effect, had become a dead letter, smothered beneath battlefields, ruined cities, and broken promises. And so we're left to ask, can an empire built on negotiation survive an emperor who governs by decree? And when compromise is abandoned, what's left to hold a fractured world together?